Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The Swamp Phantoms of Florida. The Everglades greeted me with a silence so deep it felt like a warning. This wasn't the kind of place you visited for comfort, but I wasn't looking for comfort. I came to lose myself. Ben would have laughed at the irony. He always said I overthought everything, that I needed to just live. But ever since his accident, it felt like living was the hardest thing to do. I still remember the day I found out, the phone call that had shattered my world. Ben, my little brother, the one person who had always understood me, gone in an instant. A car accident on a rainy night. They said it was quick. But all I could feel was the weight of that absence, crushing me from the inside out. So here I was, at the edge of the Florida Everglades, trying to outrun my own grief. The swamp was thick with humidity, the air heavy, almost suffocating. It smelled like damp earth and rotting vegetation. Not the kind of smell that invites you to stay. But somehow, it felt right. The quiet, the isolation. I could almost forget for a while, forget the emptiness that had swallowed my life since Ben was gone. The dirt path under my boots crunched faintly as I approached the water's edge. The kayak sat waiting on the ground, its bright orange hull shining in the afternoon sun. I'd been planning this trip for weeks, thinking it would be the perfect distraction, a way to clear my mind. I had no idea how wrong I was. "Don't stray too far," a voice called from behind me. I turned to see an old man standing by a ranger's truck, his face tanned and weathered, with eyes that seemed to have seen too much. He looked at me with a mix of suspicion and concern. "People get lost out there. Swamps don't take kindly to wanderers," he warned, his voice gravelly. "I'll be fine," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He gave me a long, searching look, his expression unreadable. "You're not the first to say that." I didn't know if he meant that as a warning or just a statement of fact, but I didn't want to engage any further. I smiled weakly and nodded before turning my attention back to the water. With practiced ease, I unstrapped the kayak and slid it into the water. The sound of the boat gently gliding through the surface of the swamp was the only noise in the otherwise oppressive silence. I pushed off the shore, and the ripples spread outward, distorting the reflection of the trees and the sky above. The swamp seemed to swallow the noise whole. I paddled slowly at first, letting the rhythm of the movement calm my nerves. The water was dark, almost black, like liquid obsidian. Beneath the surface, I could imagine all sorts of things lurking, crocodiles, snakes, and countless creatures whose names I didn't want to know. The kind of things that lived in places where the sun rarely touched, where shadows thrived. But it was peaceful in a way. Peaceful in the way that being lost can sometimes feel, like you're finally free from everything that haunts you. Why do they say people disappear here? I asked the question out loud, but no one answered. The sound of my own voice felt strange in the emptiness. Just another drop in the vast ocean of silence that stretched before me. I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't here for ghosts. I was here to forget. But deep down, I knew the swamp had its own stories. Old stories, stories of things better left alone. And though I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. The breeze shifted, and the water rippled slightly in response, the shadows along the bank seeming to lengthen as though the trees were stretching their limbs toward me. I couldn't see it, but I felt it, the tug of something unseen, something waiting. With every stroke of the paddle, I ventured deeper into the heart of the swamp. I was moving away from the world I knew and into a place where time seemed to stand still. The farther I went, the more I felt myself fading, becoming a part of this strange, forgotten world. Maybe I had come here to escape, but I wasn't sure if I was escaping my grief or if I was simply running towards something else. Something far darker. As I finished unloading the kayak, the old man lingered by his truck, watching me like he expected me to change my mind. His faded uniform and battered ranger's hat gave him the air of someone who'd been here far too long. "You sure about this?" he asked again, his voice cutting through the thick, humid air. I forced a smile. "It's just a day trip. Nothing to worry about." He grunted, clearly unimpressed. "You'd be surprised how many people said the same thing and didn't come back." That caught my attention. "What do you mean?" He leaned against the door of his truck, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. "Tourists. Hikers. Even locals. Swamps like this don't play fair. They're alive, in a way. They remember. Some say they take what they're owed." I rolled my eyes, trying to keep my tone light. "Sounds like a ghost story." "It's more than that," he said sharply, his voice low but firm. "Folks see things out there. Things they shouldn't. Faces in the water. Voices calling their names. And when they go looking..." He let the sentence hang, his meaning clear. "Right," I said, forcing a chuckle. "So, what? Swamp phantoms? Haunted reeds? Is this where you tell me to stay on the marked trails?" The old man's eyes narrowed. "There are no trails out there. Just water and what lies beneath. You think you're safe because you've got kayak and a GPS? Think again. The swamp doesn't care about your toys." I hesitated, but only for a moment. I wasn't about to let some campfire tale scare me off. "I'll keep that in mind," I said, turning back to the kayak. "You've been warned," he said, climbing into his truck. The engine sputtered to life, and he gave me one last look before pulling away, leaving a thin cloud of dust in his wake. For a moment, I stood there, the silence pressing in again. His words hung in the air like a bad omen, but I shook them off. Ghost stories were for kids. Still, as I pushed off from the shore and paddled into the still, dark water, I couldn't help but glance back. The ranger's truck was gone, but his words lingered, whispering at the edges of my thoughts. Faces in the water. Voices calling their names. The paddle dipped into the swamp, breaking the reflection of the trees into ripples. I laughed quietly to myself. Ghosts in the swamp? Yeah, right. But as the silence of the Everglades wrapped around me, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching. The further I paddled, the more the world around me seemed to shift. At first, it was subtle, less sunlight breaking through the dense canopy above, a coolness settling over the water despite the Florida heat. The sounds of the swamp, once alive with chirping insects and the occasional bird call, began to fade. I hadn't noticed it immediately, but when I stopped paddling to take a drink from my water bottle, the silence hit me like a weight. Nothing. No rustling leaves, no buzzing mosquitoes, no distant cries of herons. Just the faint drip of water sliding off my paddle and the low thrum of my own breathing. I glanced around, trying to pinpoint the change. The trees seemed taller here, their roots gnarled and twisted as they clawed at the water's surface. Moss hung from their branches in long, threadbare strands, swaying gently even though there was no wind. The air felt heavier, pressing against my chest like it didn't want me to go any further. Shaking off the unease, I kept paddling. My oar cut through the still water, sending ripples that disappeared far too quickly. The swamp seemed to absorb everything, the light, the sound, even the movement. And then came the feeling. It started as a faint prickling at the back of my neck, the kind you get when you know someone is watching. I paused, letting the kayak glide silently forward. My eyes scanned the trees, the reeds, the shadows that stretched across the water. Nothing moved, but the sensation only grew stronger, crawling down my spine. I told myself it was just my imagination, a side effect of the ranger's spooky tales and the suffocating quiet. But my hands tightened on the paddle, and my heartbeat quickened in spite of myself. The reeds ahead shifted slightly, the movement so small I might have missed it if I wasn't staring. It wasn't the breeze, there was none. It was as if something had brushed against them. I squinted, leaning forward instinctively. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding too loud in the oppressive silence. No answer. The water around the kayak rippled, though I hadn't moved. I held my breath, waiting for the familiar sight of a fish or maybe a turtle. But there was nothing beneath the surface, just dark water that seemed to stretch endlessly downward. "You're imagining things," I muttered, gripping the paddle tighter. I forced myself to keep moving, but the unease didn't leave. With every stroke, the swamp seemed to close in around me, the trees leaning closer, their shadows darker. The stillness wasn't just unsettling, it was wrong, as though the entire swamp was holding its breath. For the first time, I wondered if I'd made a mistake coming here. The kayak drifted into a wider section of the swamp, where the water was still and glass-like, mirroring the twisted trees above. I slowed my paddling, staring down at the dark surface. It was like looking into another world, a shadowy reflection of the one I occupied. As I moved, something in the water caught my eye, a shape, faint and out of place. My breath hitched as I realized what I was seeing. It was a face. Not just any face. Ben's. His eyes were wide and staring, just as I remembered them from the last photo we'd taken together. His hair floated as though he were underwater, and his mouth was slightly open, as if he was about to speak. "Ben?" I whispered, my voice cracking. I leaned over the edge of the kayak, my hand hovering just above the surface of the water. The reflection didn't move, didn't ripple, it simply was. "Ben, is that you?" I asked louder this time, my voice trembling. The face blinked. I gasped, jerking back and nearly tipping the kayak. The paddle clattered across the hull as I gripped the sides, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. When I looked again, the water was smooth, undisturbed. The reflection was gone, replaced by the usual murky nothingness. "No," I muttered, shaking my head. That wasn't real. I turned sharply, scanning the trees and shadows around me. "Who's there?" I called, my voice echoing faintly. But the swamp was as still as ever, its silence mocking me. It had to be my imagination. The ranger's warning, the grief still fresh in my mind, it was playing tricks on me. Ben was gone, and I knew that. But the image of his face lingered, burned into my vision as though it had been real. I tightened my grip on the paddle, forcing myself to breathe slowly. "It's nothing," I told myself. "Just stress." just the swamp messing with me. The kayak rocked slightly, the water beneath it rippling as if in response. But even as I started paddling again, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I paddled faster, trying to outrun the image burned into my mind. The reflection of Ben, no, the illusion of Ben, was nothing more than a trick of my tired mind. That's what I told myself, over and over. Grief could do strange things to a person. It could make you see things that weren't there, hear voices that never spoke. That's all it was, the swamp playing with my emotions, twisting my loss into something tangible. The thought should have comforted me, but it didn't. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, and the light filtering through the trees was fading fast. Shadows stretched across the water, their edges blurring with the darkness beneath. I checked my watch. Evening was creeping in, sooner than I'd expected. The silence was what struck me the hardest. Earlier, the swamp had been alive with the buzz of insects, the rustle of leaves, the occasional splash of a fish. Now, there was nothing. No birds, no frogs, not even the faint hum of mosquitoes. It was as if the swamp itself had gone still, holding its breath. I forced myself to focus on the paddle strokes, the rhythmic dip and pull of the water. But with every stroke, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It wasn't just paranoia anymore, it was instinct, raw and undeniable. The trees loomed closer, their roots twisting like claws into the water. The moss hanging from their branches seemed to sway without any wind, like unseen hands tugged at them. "Calm down," I muttered under my breath. "There's nothing here. It's just your mind playing tricks on you." But even as I said it, my body betrayed me. My hands were clammy, gripping the paddle too tightly. My breathing quickened, shallow and uneven. A faint sound broke the silence, a soft ripple, like something moving through the water. I froze, my paddle hovering above the surface. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The sound stopped. I scanned the water, the shadows, the spaces between the trees. Nothing moved, but the sense of presence was undeniable. It was the same feeling you get when you wake up at night, sure that someone is standing over you, even though you can't see them. "I'm just imagining things," I whispered, trying to convince myself. But the swamp felt alive in a way it hadn't before, and it wasn't welcoming. It was watching. Waiting. I paddled harder, desperate to reach open water or some sign of civilization. The kayak sliced through the stillness, but it felt like the swamp was closing in around me, like it was drawing me deeper into its grasp. The reflection of Ben had been the start, but now I couldn't help but wonder, what if the ranger wasn't just telling stories? I didn't turn back. Something about the swamp, the silence, the weight of the air, was pulling me forward. Maybe I was chasing a thrill, something to push aside the ache of loss, or maybe I was too stubborn to admit I was scared. But the idea of turning around, of heading back to the shore, felt wrong. So, I pressed on, searching for that perfect photo, the one that would capture the essence of the place. The still water, the tangled roots, the twisted trees. It seemed like the right thing to do, to see the beauty, to appreciate the landscape for what it was. A moment of calm, a break from the madness inside me. But as I paddled deeper, the swamp seemed to stretch farther and farther. The trees loomed higher, their dark branches entwined like fingers reaching toward each other, blocking out the sky. There was no sunlight filtering through anymore, just an eerie twilight that made it impossible to tell what time it was. The water around me was dark, almost black, and the more I stared into it, the less I could distinguish between the surface and the depths beneath. I glanced at my GPS, a small device clipped to the front of the kayak. I'd been following it, heading in a general direction, but now it seemed off. The little dot that represented me was moving erratically, jumping from one place to another, as if the signal couldn't quite make up its mind. I cursed under my breath. "Come on," I muttered, tapping the screen, but the signal didn't improve. The blue dot kept flickering, disappearing for seconds at a time before reappearing in an entirely different spot. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the glitching screen, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The ranger's words echoed in the back of my mind, but I dismissed them. This is just technology failing. You're not lost. You're fine. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I tried to focus on the surroundings, but the swamp was confusing. Every bend in the water looked the same. The shadows were thick, and the trees seemed to crowd in around me, their twisted forms shifting with every movement of the kayak. My paddling grew slower, more deliberate, as I started to lose track of where I had been. I thought I saw a landmark, something familiar, just ahead, but when I approached it, it melted away into the mist. The same shapes, the same dark water. There was no way I had been here before. And yet, the feeling of déjà vu clung to me, wrapping tighter with each stroke. I tried to push forward, my eyes scanning for something, anything, to prove I was still on the right track. But everything was starting to blend together. The trees, the water, the reflections, nothing was distinct anymore. I checked the GPS again. Still nothing. I felt the panic begin to claw at the edges of my mind. "All right, just take a deep breath," I told myself. "You're not lost. You're just disoriented. It's easy to get turned around in a place like this." But the longer I paddled, the more it felt like the swamp was closing in, deliberately leading me away from anything familiar. The sounds of the world beyond, people, animals, were gone. It was just me and the dark water now, and the more I tried to push forward, the further the shore seemed to get. I was beginning to feel like the swamp itself was hiding. The stillness was oppressive, like the swamp had swallowed every sound but my own frantic breathing. I kept paddling, but the weight of the silence was suffocating. I was alone, and the deeper I went, the more it felt like the swamp was pushing me to stay there, to get lost. Then I heard it. A soft whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, like someone calling my name. "Alex." It came from the trees, or maybe from the water. I couldn't tell. The sound seemed to float on the air, like a breath, so light and delicate that for a second I thought it was just the wind. But there was no wind. I froze. My heart thudded hard in my chest. "Alex." This time, I was sure I heard it. My name, whispered gently, almost lovingly, like it was meant for me. The voice was familiar. It was Ben's voice. I jerked around, my eyes scanning the water, the trees, every corner of the swamp around me. But there was nothing. Just the same oppressive quiet. "Ben?" I called out, my voice trembling. It was weak, unsure. But the swamp swallowed it whole, offering no answer. For a moment, I thought I must be imagining it, playing tricks on myself. Grief had a way of distorting things. Ben had been gone for months now. This was just the weight of it all, the ache that made me hear what I wanted to hear. "You're hearing things," I told myself. "It's the swamp, the isolation. You're just stressed. This isn't real." But then, the whisper came again. "Alex." It was clearer now. A chill ran down my spine. My hands gripped the paddle so tightly I thought I might snap it. The voice sounded like Ben. It sounded like him calling to me, like he was just there, waiting. But my mind screamed that it couldn't be him. I wanted to call it again, to shout his name, to demand that he show himself. But my throat tightened, and instead, I swallowed hard, trying to push down the surge of panic. I glanced around again, desperately searching for any sign of movement, anything that could explain the voice. But there was nothing. "It's just the swamp," I repeated in my mind. "It's just your mind playing tricks." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The voice could have been the wind or an echo. Maybe it was another person, someone lost like me. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more I felt the pull, the urge to follow the voice, to search for the source. The swamp seemed to call me, to promise something just beyond my reach. "Ben?" I whispered into the stillness. The sound of my own voice made my heart race, and for the briefest moment, I felt a flash of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't a trick. But there was no answer. Only the whispering silence, stretching on and on. I was about to convince myself it was nothing, just the weight of the swamp, the grief, the isolation, when the mist rolled in. It wasn't sudden, but gradual. The air grew heavier, thicker, as though the swamp itself was exhaling a dense fog that blanketed the water. The light dimmed even further, and the trees around me seemed to dissolve into shadows, their twisted limbs becoming indistinct. I strained my eyes, trying to see through the haze. Then, I saw it. A figure. At first, it was just a shape, blurry and indistinct, like a trick of the mist. But as I looked closer, my breath caught in my throat. It was Ben. I knew it immediately. He stood at the edge of the fog, his figure barely discernible in the shifting mist, but there was no mistaking the posture, the familiar way he stood, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if waiting for me. His eyes were locked on mine. I felt my pulse race, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. His expression was unreadable, but I could see the faintest glimmer of something in his gaze, something that seemed to beckon me closer. His lips didn't move, but I could feel his presence, could sense him there, just beyond my reach. "Ben?" I whispered, though my voice sounded foreign, fragile, even to myself. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just looked. His figure was blurry, like a smudge on the edge of the world. But his eyes, those eyes, were real. I could feel my throat closing up, the air around me suddenly growing colder. I should have been scared, I knew that. I should have turned the kayak and paddled the other way, but I couldn't. Something kept me frozen, staring at that figure in the mist. But then the unease started to spread, like a cold hand creeping up my spine. It wasn't just Ben standing there, it was something else. A presence in the swamp, something watching me from the shadows. This isn't real. This can't be real. I blinked once, twice, and when I opened my eyes again, Ben was still there, standing motionless, his gaze unwavering. I don't know what made me snap, but suddenly, panic hit. It tore through me like a wildfire. I grabbed the paddle with both hands, throwing all my strength into a desperate stroke, turning the kayak hard to the left, away from him. The kayak rocked violently, and the water splashed up around me as I paddled faster, my movements frantic and uncoordinated. The fog was thickening around me, and the silhouette of Ben remained, a shadow in the distance, barely visible but somehow there. I looked back just once, and for a fleeting second, I thought I saw him move, just a twitch of his arm, or maybe it was just my imagination. But it didn't matter. I had to get away. I paddled harder, the fear clawing at my chest, pushing me to go faster, faster. The sound of the water against the kayak was deafening now, drowning out everything else. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't just running away from the fog, from Ben. I was running away from something else, something far worse that was closing in around me. But the mist pressed in tighter, thicker, and even though I was paddling as fast as I could, the feeling of being pursued, of something lurking just out of sight, was relentless. It followed me, even in the silence, even in the fog. The fog enveloped me, thick and suffocating, cutting off the world around me. My heart was racing, my breaths coming in shallow, panic gasps. I kept paddling, my hands slick on the oar, but it didn't matter how hard I tried to move. The mist was thick and oppressive, and the presence behind me, the feeling of being followed, never left. This isn't real. But even as I told myself that, the voice in my head faltered. I wasn't sure anymore. I couldn't get away from it, the memory of Ben, his face, his eyes, that familiar way he always looked at me with concern, always just a step ahead, always the protector. It had been that way for as long as I could remember. He was older, stronger, the one who knew how to keep me safe from the world. And I had always counted on him. Until the accident. Until I failed him. My mind drifted back to that night, an image so vivid it felt like it was happening all over again. We had been hiking together. It wasn't supposed to be dangerous. Just a simple trail. But Ben had always pushed us further, convinced me to keep going when I wanted to turn back. It had started raining heavily, the path turning slick and treacherous. I begged him to stop, to turn around. But Ben never listened. He was the older brother, the one who knew everything, who thought he could handle anything. And I, the younger, weaker one, just followed. I could still hear the sound of his voice calling out in the rain, laughing as we slipped and slid down the muddy trail. Then the slip. The fall. The scream. I could still hear it, feel it, as if it were happening again. Ben's voice, shocking, desperate, as he fell, his hand reaching for mine but missing. I couldn't catch him, couldn't save him. He had been gone before I even reached the bottom. The doctors told me he hit his head too hard, that he hadn't stood a chance. But I knew better. It wasn't the rain or the mud. It was me. It was my fault. I should have stopped him. I should have said no. I should have turned back sooner. But I hadn't. I hadn't been strong enough to stop him. And now, every night since, I saw his face in my dreams, the face of the brother I couldn't protect. And now, here, in the mist, in the swamp, I saw him again. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The guilt, the shame, it was like a weight I couldn't escape. I had buried it, convinced myself that it was just part of the grief, part of the mourning process. But it never stopped. It followed me. It haunted me. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to shake it off, but the image of Ben's face, his figure standing in the fog, refused to fade. Is this real? Was I really seeing him? Was it his ghost reaching out to me from the other side? Or was it just my guilt, my feelings of inadequacy, playing tricks on me? The swamp seemed to pull at my mind, twisting reality and memory together until I couldn't tell which was which. I had to know. I had to figure it out. Was this the swamp, the mist, the isolation? Or was this something else? Something far more sinister? I looked around, trying to find something, anything real, but the fog was so thick now that I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. Every shadow seemed to shift, every sound seemed distorted. I reached out with the paddle, trying to steady myself, but the water felt wrong, like it was slipping beneath me. Am I losing my mind? No. I couldn't let that be the answer. I wouldn't let it be. But as I looked ahead, I thought I saw the shape again, the figure, barely visible in the mist, standing so still it could have been a trick of my mind. I closed my eyes, forced myself to breathe deeply, and when I opened them again, it was gone. But the weight of it stayed. The memory, the guilt, the question, was it Ben? Or was it something else, something the swamp had conjured from the darkness of my own soul? I couldn't tell anymore. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. The mist was relentless, wrapping around me like a shroud. Every stroke of the paddle felt heavier, each movement more difficult than the last. The air seemed to press in on me, cold and damp, and my breath came out in sharp, panic bursts. My thoughts were jumbled, a tangle of guilt and fear, but most of all, there was a gnawing sense of isolation. I need to get out of here. I fumbled for my phone in the pocket of my jacket, my hands trembling. The screen lit up as I unlocked it, and I quickly checked for a signal. Nothing. The little bar indicator showed a single, faint bar flickering weakly. Maybe just enough for a call, I thought, a fleeting hope rising in my chest. I pressed my thumb to the phone's dialer, my heart pounding with the urgency of it all. The sound of my finger tapping the screen seemed unbearably loud in the stillness of the swamp. I was still paddling, my movements erratic as my nerves stretched thin. I dialed the number for the ranger station, my mind screaming for a response, for anyone to answer. But the call didn't even go through. The screen blinked once, twice, and then the call dropped. The phone went silent, and the single bar of service disappeared entirely. No signal. A cold wave of panic hit me, deep and sharp. The weight of the swamp closed in, and for the first time since I'd been out here, I truly felt alone. I tried again, tapping the screen faster now, my fingers slick with sweat. But it was no use. The phone was useless. No signal. No way to contact anyone. I cursed under my breath, throwing the phone back into my pocket. My chest tightened. The isolation hit me like a punch, a physical sensation that left me gasping for air. The swamp stretched endlessly before me, and now there was no way out, no escape. I had no one to turn to, no one who could find me. I was cut off from the world. I turned the kayak, paddling again, but there was nowhere to go. Every direction seemed the same, just thick trees, murky water, and an endless, suffocating fog that blotted out any sense of where I was. I couldn't even see the horizon. I had no way of knowing which way was north, south, east, or west. I looked down at the water, watching it swirl lazily around the edge of the kayak. The stillness was unnerving. It wasn't just the absence of the usual sounds, no birds, no rustling of leaves, no buzz of insects. It was the absolute quiet, the kind that made you feel like the world itself had been swallowed up. A noise broke the silence, splash, distant, like something breaking the surface of the water far behind me. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. I twisted around, my eyes searching the fog. Nothing. It was probably just a fish, I thought. Or maybe the wind. Or maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. I swallowed hard, but the weight in my chest didn't ease. I was alone, utterly alone. And now, I couldn't even reach out for help. No phone, no signal, just me, the swamp, and whatever else was out there watching. I paddled again, not knowing where I was going. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to escape this. I could feel the panic creeping back in, seizing me, making it hard to breathe. My hands gripped the paddles so tightly that they started to ache, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered. I was losing control. The fog had only thickened as I drifted deeper into the swamp, the world around me a dull blur of shadows and water. My paddle strokes were slow now, the rhythm of them almost mechanical as my mind drifted in and out of focus. I had lost track of time. The swamp was a place that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of the world, and now it felt as though I was trapped in some timeless limbo. Every bend in the water looked the same. Every shadow seemed to hold the same mystery. I should have turned back. I knew that. But something kept pulling me forward, like I was being led deeper into the murk. And then I saw it. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. The mist was so thick, the light so faint, that I barely noticed the figure standing by the water's edge until it was almost too late. It wasn't Ben this time. It was Adam. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, trying to clear the fog that had settled into my mind. But when I looked again, there he was, standing on the bank of the swamp. Adam. I couldn't breathe for a moment. It was impossible. I hadn't seen him in years. He had died long before Ben. A car accident. I hadn't even been there, hadn't even known what had happened until the call came. One moment he was supposed to meet me for a drink, and the next, he was gone. The shock had been unbearable. I still couldn't quite wrap my mind around it, but it hurt, deep down, like a wound that never fully healed. And now, here he was, standing at the edge of the swamp as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't been gone for all this time. He was waving at me. A wide, open gesture, as though calling me over. The motion was familiar, so familiar it made my heart twist in my chest. The way he moved. The way his hand was outstretched. It was just like Adam. It wasn't a hallucination. It couldn't be. I couldn't bring myself to look away from him. Alex, his voice echoed in my mind, even though his lips hadn't moved. It was as clear as if he were standing right next to me, whispering my name. I heard it again. Alex, over here. I felt a strange pull, an undeniable tug. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to turn the kayak around, to keep going, to not approach. But the rest of me, the part that was still grieving, still lost in the past, wanted to reach out. I leaned forward, my paddle slowing, my hands shaking. I could hear the faint rustle of the leaves, the sound of the water gently lapping against the shore. The mist swirled around Adam's figure, but I could still see him clearly, standing so perfectly still, his eyes locked on mine. I wanted to call out, wanted to ask him what he was doing here, how this was even possible, but I couldn't. My throat had gone dry, my mouth too parched to speak. But the question didn't matter. Not anymore. The pull, the lure of seeing him again, seeing Adam again, was too strong. I could feel the grief that had been buried so deep inside of me rising, flooding my chest, making it impossible to think. Maybe it's not a trick. I reached for the paddle, my fingers numb, and started to push the kayak toward the shore. It felt like I was moving in slow motion, the water resisting me as though the swamp itself didn't want me to get any closer. But I ignored it. I couldn't stop now. Just a few more feet. Just a little closer. Adam kept waving, his figure standing perfectly still, waiting. The mist parted for a moment, and for a brief instant, I thought I saw him smile. I knew better. I had to know better. But then, as I drew closer to the shore, a sudden gust of wind whipped through the trees, and the water splashed around me. I felt my heart race, my stomach twisting with something that wasn't quite fear, but it should have been. It was too late to stop. I was already moving toward him. My heart was pounding in my chest as I approached the shore, the water slapping gently against the sides of the kayak. I could feel the weight of my own hesitation pulling at me, the rational side of my mind screaming, "This isn't real. This can't be real." But even as I told myself that, I didn't stop. It's just a trick of the fog, I thought, my hands trembling on the sides of the kayak. This isn't Adam. This is just the swamp playing with me. It's playing with my grief. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat, but the sound of his name, my name, echoed in my head again. "Alex, come over here." It was so familiar, so soothing, like it belonged to another time, a time before all the pain, before the loss. I could feel the fog pressing in, thickening, wrapping itself around me like an invisible hand. The swamp was quiet, unearthingly so, and yet, in the distance, I could still see Adam's figure waiting for me. His arm was still extended, that familiar wave beckoning me forward. No, this can't be happening. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind. This was impossible. Adam was dead. I saw his funeral, heard the eulogies, felt the finality of his loss. This wasn't him. This was some twisted figment of my mind, some manifestation of my guilt, my loneliness. But the temptation was so strong. The need to reach him, to talk to him again, to see him once more, it was overwhelming. I could feel my body leaning forward, the paddle slipping from my grasp as I steadied myself in the kayak. My legs were unsteady, the muscles in my arms aching from the effort of keeping the boat in place. But it didn't matter. All I could focus on was the figure ahead of me. Just a few steps. Just a few steps, and I'll know. I had no idea what I would know, or even what I was looking for. Some part of me knew, deep down, that whatever it was standing there was not my friend, not the person I had lost so many years ago. But the pull was too strong to resist. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and ragged in the silence. My hands, still trembling, gripped the sides of the kayak as I slowly pulled myself out. The water was cold and murky beneath my feet, the mud sucking at my boots as I carefully stepped onto the shore. What am I doing? I didn't ask myself the question out loud, but the thought was there, sharp and insistent, trying to claw at the edges of my consciousness. Why was I doing this? What did I hope to find? But as I glanced up at Adam's figure again, the answer was simple. I had to know. There was no rational thought now, no hesitation. The world around me felt hazy, unreal, like I was moving through a dream, caught between the past and the present, between what was and what could never be again. And still, there he was, waiting. I took a step forward, then another, my boots squelching in the thick mud. The swamp seemed to hold its breath, everything suspended in the tension of the moment. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm just broken. But as I took another step, I knew the truth. I wasn't just looking for Adam. I was looking for closure. For answers. For something to make all this pain go away. If I just get closer, if I just see him, hear him, touch him, then maybe it'll all make sense. But with each step, the doubts continued to gnaw at me. What if it's not him? What if it's something else? Something darker, something that preys on the weak, on the lost? My pulse quickened, my feet no longer steady as the swamp seemed to shift beneath me, the ground sinking slightly with every step I took. My gaze never left Adam, even as the rational side of me screamed to turn back. Just a few more feet. I was almost there. Almost within reach. And for the first time since I'd lost both Ben and Adam, I felt hopeful. Maybe this is what I need. Maybe this is the answer. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I felt something else, something sharp and cold, a warning, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. The swamp was silent again, but the air felt heavier, darker. I hesitated for a moment, staring at Adam's outstretched arm. And then, something in his posture changed. The smile that had once been so familiar, it wasn't a smile anymore. It twisted, became something unsettling, something wrong. And I froze. What have I done? I should have stopped. I should have turned back the moment the smile twisted, the moment the air shifted, but I didn't. My feet kept moving, my body no longer under my control. It was as if I was drawn forward by some unseen force, unable to resist, even as my mind screamed for me to stop. The swamp was changing around me, becoming something else, something darker. The fog seemed to thicken with every step I took, swirling around my legs like hands, pulling me deeper into the murk. It wasn't just the mist that was shifting. The very landscape seemed to warp, like a dream slipping into nightmare. The trees were no longer the familiar cypress and oak I had seen before. These were twisted, gnarled things, their branches curling in unnatural angles, reaching out like skeletal arms. Their bark was blackened, burned even in places, and the air around them was thick with the stench of rot. I could hear the faint creaking of the trees, as if they were alive, their limbs straining, cracking under an invisible weight. The ground beneath my feet had become treacherous, uneven, as though the very earth was fighting me, trying to pull me down into the muck. Each step felt like a battle. The mud sucked at my boots, dragging me back with every movement. I lifted one foot, only to feel the earth cling to it as if it didn't want me to leave. What's happening? I glanced over my shoulder, but the path I had come from was already swallowed by the fog. The shoreline, the kayak, even Adam, everything was gone. I was alone now, deep in the heart of the swamp, the familiar world behind me fading like a distant memory. I didn't want to admit it, but fear was creeping up my spine. I had walked into something that was beyond my understanding. The world had shifted. The swamp was no longer just a place, it was something else. Something ancient, alive. I forced myself to focus, to push the rising panic down. But the forest, or whatever it was now, kept changing, becoming even more bizarre the further I went. The trees twisted even more violently, their trunks bending at angles, their branches reaching across the sky like claws. Some of them were stripped bare, while others seemed to throb with a strange energy, their leaves a deep, unnatural red, as if they were feeding on something. I heard a rustling behind me, but when I turned, the space was empty. Yet, I felt eyes on me, watching, waiting. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of the trees or the distant splash of water that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I tried to steady my breathing, but every breath felt harder to take. The air was thick, heavy with moisture, and the scent of decay seemed to be getting stronger. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep walking. My legs were growing heavier, each step an effort, my body exhausted from the unnatural weight of the swamp. And yet, I couldn't stop. Something was calling me forward. I pushed through the trees, stumbling over roots that seemed to grab at my legs, tripping me up. It was as though the swamp itself was testing me, forcing me to prove my worthiness to enter deeper into its heart. And then I saw it. In the distance, through the fog, I caught sight of a shape, tall, thin, and outlined against the thickening mist. Adam. But he wasn't the same. His figure was now distorted, stretched in unnatural ways, like a shadow that refused to conform to reality. He stood there, still and unmoving, beckoning me forward. I felt my heart race, my blood pounding in my ears. It's not him. It can't be. I shook my head, trying to shake the vision from my mind, but the pull was too strong. No. Don't go. I could feel the ground beneath me shift again, the trees pressing in, their twisted limbs reaching out to trap me. The fog was thick now, suffocating, and with every step, it seemed as if the world was closing in around me. I was trapped. The swamp had become something else entirely, a living, breathing thing, and I was caught in its grip. Every path I tried to take only led me further into its depths, further into the labyrinth of trees and shadows. The more I struggled, the more it seemed as if the swamp was alive, watching, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat felt tight, my chest heavy. I tried to run, but my feet refused to cooperate. The trees seemed to grow even more twisted, the roots more insistent, pulling me back, trapping me. The vision of Adam flickered again, his distorted figure now closer, closer than ever. He wasn't smiling anymore. His face was empty, hollow, like the swamp itself had drained him of everything he had once been. This isn't real. This can't be real. But the pull was relentless, and I had no choice but to move toward him. As I stumbled deeper into the twisted forest, the fog seemed to thicken even more, swallowing up the trees around me. The ground was a treacherous mess of slick mud and tangled roots, and every step I took felt as if the swamp itself was trying to drag me under. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion, a mixture of fear and disbelief. What is happening to me? Then, through the heavy mist, I saw something unexpected. It was a shape, half obscured by the fog, but there was no mistaking it. A camera. An old, vintage model, lying abandoned on the muddy shore of a small inlet. The sight of it was strange, out of place, and yet it called to me. The swamp, it seemed, was full of surprises, but this was something I had to investigate. I approached it cautiously, the weight of my fear pulling at my every step. The camera was old, its black leather body cracked with age, the lens fogged up with years of neglect. It looked as if it had been there for years, forgotten by whoever had once owned it. But there was something about it, something magnetic, that made me reach down to pick it up. My fingers brushed against the cold metal, and the moment I held it, a chill ran through me. It wasn't just the coldness of the swamp, nor the dampness in the air. It was something else, something deeper. A connection, a pull, like the camera had been waiting for me. As though it was meant to be found. The first thing I noticed was the film inside. It was still loaded, its edges frayed and worn. A part of me considered leaving it behind, but curiosity pushed me forward. I had to see what it contained. I turned the camera on, the ancient shutter clicking as I took a quick look at the photos that had already been taken. They were blurry, distorted, but what caught my eye was something strange, figures, people, caught in the fog. But none of them looked entirely right. The first photo showed a man with dark hair and a wide grin standing in the midst of a dense fog. His eyes, though, were wrong. They were hollow, empty, staring out from the picture with an unsettling intensity. There was something about the photo that made my stomach twist, like it wasn't just an image, it was alive, somehow. The next photo was even stranger. It was of a woman, but her features were blurred, her body almost disintegrating into the mist. In the corner of the photo, I could make out something that didn't belong, a shadow, a shape that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the frame. It looked like a hand reaching out, but not from the woman. From something else. I flipped through more of the photos, each one more bizarre and unsettling than the last. People standing alone in the fog, their faces obscured, their bodies blurred and stretched. They all looked familiar, like they could have been from my own life, or maybe they were just the faces of others who had wandered into this swamp, lost to its depths. But it wasn't just the figures that made me uneasy. It was the sense that these photos were somehow connected to me, to my past. Each one seemed to tug at something deep inside me, an emotional chord I couldn't quite identify. Faces of people I thought I had forgotten. People I had lost. Could it be? I thought, my mind reeling. Could these be people who came here before me? Were they trapped in this place too? I turned the camera over in my hands, hoping to find a clue, some mark that could explain the strange phenomenon. And that's when I saw it. A name written faintly on the back of the camera's body, Ben. Ben? The blood drained from my face. My brother's name, etched into the very object I had found, seemed to echo in my mind. Was this some kind of twisted sign? Or was it just a coincidence? I tried to shake off the feeling of dread creeping up my spine, but it wouldn't leave. No, I told myself, this is just a camera. It doesn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew. I knew that this camera, this moment, was something far more significant than I wanted to admit. As I stared down at the photo, the air around me grew colder, the fog denser. And then, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking just behind me, waiting for me to turn around. The footsteps grew louder, closer, but when I spun around, no one was there. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breathing shallow and erratic. Something was wrong. The swamp, the fog, the figures in the photos, it was all connected. I need to leave. Now. But I couldn't move. The camera in my hands was heavy, as if pulling me down, holding me in place. My mind screamed to run, to get away from this place, but my feet were rooted to the ground. The footsteps continued, but they weren't the only thing I heard. There was something else, something soft, barely audible, a whisper in the fog, calling my name. And for a split second, I almost thought I heard the voice of my brother. The whisper of my name sent a shiver down my spine, my body freezing in place. I knew that voice. But it couldn't be him. Not this time. My brother, Ben, wasn't here. He wasn't in this swamp. He wasn't anywhere. He was gone, lost to that terrible accident that still haunted my every waking moment. Yet, the voice, faint and hollow, reached into me, pulling at something deep inside. I had already seen his face in the mist, felt his presence in the air. But now, the camera in my hand seemed to be pulsing with a life of its own, urging me to listen, to trust, to turn around. I did. My heart stopped when I saw her. The figure at the edge of the mist, my brother's shape, was no longer standing still. The silhouette that had been mere inches away a moment ago was now twisting, moving with an unnatural speed toward me. At first, it looked like Ben, but as the fog shifted, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. Her face, no, its face, was wrong. It wasn't my brother anymore. The figure's features were contorted, stretched, like something that had been twisted and pulled out of shape. The once familiar features I had known so well, the gentle curve of his face, the warmth of his smile, were now grotesque, warped into a distorted mask of terror. The skin was pale, nearly translucent, and the eyes, those eyes, were wide, empty, the pupils dilated, as if the creature was staring at me through a void. The mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, but it wasn't the smile I remembered. It was a smile of malice, a grin that never belonged to Ben. The teeth were sharp, jagged, like they didn't fit in the mouth, and they gleamed in the dim light, threatening and hungry. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating, and my body trembled uncontrollably. It took another step forward, the ground beneath its feet sinking and shifting like the swamp was alive, responding to its presence. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. My body was frozen, locked in a moment of terror, like my legs had turned to stone. Then it spoke. "Come closer, Alex." The voice was wrong. It was too hollow, too distorted. It was Ben's voice, but not. It sounded as though it was being pulled through some deep, wet chasm echoed by 1,000 other voices. I could hear the pain, the hunger in it, the need to lure me in. I forced my legs to move. They felt like they were encased in lead, but somehow I made my feet shuffle, slowly at first, then quicker as the figure took another step forward, its arms stretching, elongating, as if it was about to reach out to grab me. No. Not again. I can't. I had to run. I finally tore my eyes away from the twisted thing and stumbled backward, my body moving on pure instinct. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel its presence, feel the weight of its gaze on the back of my neck. The swamp, the trees, the fog, they all seemed to close in on me. The once open path had now become a labyrinth of shadows and gnarled roots, each step I took feeling like I was sinking deeper into the swamp's grasp. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my chest, a cold sweat coating my skin. I stumbled over a root, falling to the ground, the camera slipping from my hand and splashing into the mud. I scrambled to my feet, but the swamp seemed to be pulling at me, like it didn't want to let me go. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. All that mattered was getting away from that thing, that monster that had once been my brother. I could hear it now, the sound of something heavy moving through the fog, the steady crunch of twigs and leaves. It was close. Too close. I glanced over my shoulder. The figure was still there, following me, never losing ground. Its pace was slow, deliberate. But there was something terrifying about it. It was patient. It didn't need to hurry. I shoved through the trees, barely managing to avoid the thick branches that reached out like claws. Every time I thought I had gained a little distance, the thing would be right behind me again. And then, through the fog, I saw it. The kayak. The edge of the swamp. The place where I had first entered, the place where I thought I could escape. I surged forward, my legs burning, my mind focused solely on getting to the water, to safety. The swamp was trying to fight me every step of the way, but I pushed through, the sound of my frantic breathing drowning out everything else. The trees thinned, the fog lightened, and there it was, the kayak, still floating in the water, untouched. But before I could reach it, a hand, cold, clammy, and wet, shot out of the fog, grabbing my arm. I screamed. I twisted in panic, but the grip was ironclad. I looked up, expecting to see the twisted face of Ben, but instead, there was nothing. The mist had swallowed the figure whole. The hand pulled me back into the darkness. I fought, I kicked, I screamed. But the swamp was no longer just a place. It was alive, and it had decided I was its next victim. I couldn't see. The thick fog had closed in completely, enveloping me like a suffocating blanket. My hands shook as I pushed through the trees, each branch scraping against my skin, each step sinking deeper into the wet, treacherous ground. The familiar sounds of the swamp were now distorted, muffled by the fog. It was as though the world itself had been swallowed whole. I tried to focus, tried to calm my mind. This is just a nightmare, I told myself, the words sounding hollow in my own ears. It's just my grief. My mind is playing tricks on me. But every time I thought I had gained some clarity, the air would grow colder, the shadows would grow darker, and the sound of footsteps, soft and distant, would start again. The steps were getting closer. I was sure of it now. I couldn't hear anything else over them, no birds, no croaks of frogs, nothing. Just those deliberate, almost mocking footsteps, getting closer with every passing moment. I turned to look behind me, the flashlight in my hand shaking so badly I could barely make out the shadows around me. The beam cut through the fog, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. Nothing was there. But I knew it was there. It had to be. My heart pounded in my chest, my throat tight with panic. I forced myself to keep moving forward, pushing past the endless trees and tangled roots, but with each step, it felt like the swamp was pulling me deeper. The fog was so thick now that I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I felt like I was walking in circles, as though the swamp itself was twisting around me, changing the landscape with every step. I stopped to catch my breath, my hands trembling as I wiped the sweat from my forehead. There was no sound now. Nothing. The footsteps had stopped, but in their place, there was something else. A whisper. It was faint at first, almost too soft to hear, but it was unmistakable. My name. Alex. My stomach lurched as the voice rang out from somewhere in the fog. It was familiar. Too familiar. Alex, the voice repeated, softer now, coaxing, like a breeze brushing past my ear. Come closer. I couldn't breathe. My body froze. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The voice sounded like Ben's, but deeper, colder. It sounded like it was coming from all around me at once, bouncing off the trees and thick fog, echoing in my skull. No, no, no. I tried to tell myself that it wasn't real, that it couldn't be real. Ben was gone. I had to remember that. But that whisper, the way it called my name, it felt real. The air around me grew colder, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching across the swamp, twisting and bending unnaturally. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, but even that couldn't stop the growing dread that was clawing at me from every direction. Suddenly, the whisper stopped. A thick silence fell over the swamp, pressing down on me like a heavy weight. I waited for something, anything, to break the stillness. But it was as if time itself had stopped. The fog hung heavy, like a wall, and the darkness around me swallowed any sense of direction. I had to move. I had to find a way out. But no matter how far I walked, no matter which direction I turned, It was as if the swamp was bending and shifting around me, leading me in circles. I couldn't remember how long I had been walking. Hours? Days? It didn't feel like I had any control over time anymore. The swamp felt endless, like it stretched into some dark, otherworldly place, one that didn't obey the rules of reality. The whispers started again, this time louder, closer. There was no escape. They were everywhere now, coming from the trees, the ground, the very air itself. They grew louder and louder, overlapping each other, until they became a cacophony in my mind. Alex, come closer. The voice was unmistakable now. Ben's voice. But it wasn't just Ben. It was something else, something darker, something that wanted me to listen. My breath quickened, and my legs felt as though they might collapse beneath me. The fog had turned into something solid now, almost as though it was trying to push me down, to smother me. I stumbled forward, desperate to escape, but the more I moved, the more the fog seemed to tighten around me. And then, I saw it. Through the dense haze, there was a figure, just a shadow at first, but it was there. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to turn around, but I couldn't help it. I was drawn to it, as if something inside me was telling me I had to. The figure stood still, a dark silhouette against the fog, its outline shifting and changing with every blink. The closer I got, the more distorted it became. Its form stretched and bent unnaturally, like it was trying to take on a shape that didn't belong. The shadows around it seemed to flicker and dance, moving with a life of their own. Then, it turned. I gasped, my heart nearly stopping in my chest. The face was twisted. Not Ben's face anymore. Not a human face at all. It was distorted, stretched, the eyes dark voids, the mouth open in a silent scream. It wasn't Ben. It was something else. Something that wore his shape like a mask. The shadow reached out, its arms long and grotesque, pulling itself closer to me. Its fingers stretched, impossibly long, twisting through the air. I turned and ran without thinking. My legs carried me faster than I ever thought possible, but the shadows were following me. Always just behind me, always reaching, clawing at me from the fog. The whispers grew louder. Closer. And then, through the fog, I saw the faintest hint of light, the dim glow of my flashlight that had fallen earlier. I couldn't stop now. It was my only chance. I pushed through the thickening mist, my hands brushing against the trees, the branches slapping at my face. But the sound of the footsteps, the whispers, and the unnatural breathing were still there, closing in. I didn't know if I would make it out alive, but I knew I couldn't stop running. The air grew thicker with each passing second, a suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. I had been running for what felt like hours, but it didn't matter. The swamp had become a maze, a labyrinth of mist and shadows. I couldn't see, couldn't think straight. All that mattered was the feeling of something chasing me, something that was always just behind me, always just out of sight. But now, something had changed. The fog, the mist, wasn't just swirling around me anymore. It was moving with purpose. The once soft veil of gray had solidified into something more, something tangible. It was alive. It seemed to shift and stretch, thickening around me like a living thing, coiling through the trees and wrapping itself around the branches. I stopped dead in my tracks. The air was unnaturally still now, and the whispers, those terrible, hollow voices, had stopped, replaced by something far worse. The mist had become a dark, swirling mass, and from within it, shapes began to form. At first, They were just flickers of shadow, barely noticeable in the dim light, but as I stared, they began to take shape. Figures. Human-like silhouettes that seemed to flicker in and out of focus, their outlines constantly shifting. The forms mimicked the way people move, familiar motions, familiar faces, but something was wrong. They were too fluid, too distorted. And their eyes. I could feel them even though they weren't real. They stared into me, through me, as if they were searching for something. Alex. The voice was soft, tender, too familiar. It sounded just like my mother's voice. No. No, this isn't her. It can't be. I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. But the figure didn't go away. It stepped closer, its silhouette materializing out of the fog with an eerie, unnatural grace. The mist seemed to pulse and breathe with it, as if it were part of the same entity. Come back, Alex. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my legs felt heavy, like they were stuck in quicksand. The figure reached toward me with long, slender arms, its fingers extending like claws, pulling the mist with it. Come home, Alex, it whispered again, and in that moment, I saw it, the unmistakable outline of my mother, or what should have been my mother. Her face was pale and stretched, her eyes hollow, empty of the warmth and kindness I remembered. There was no compassion in them, only a deep, unnatural void. I couldn't breathe. I stepped back, shaking my head, but another figure appeared from the mist. A man this time. A tall, familiar shape, Ben. His face, his real face, was now obscured by the swirling fog, but I knew it was him. His posture was the same, his hands reaching out toward me, the faintest outline of a smile playing at the corners of his lips. Alex, he said softly, his voice strained with desperation. You're so close. Just come closer. The mist was moving faster now, swirling around him like a living thing. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as the fog twisted around us, distorting the reality around me. These figures, they looked like the people I had lost. They sounded like them. But they weren't them. I knew that. Deep down, I knew it. The figures reached for me, their hands stretching toward my face, their voices growing louder, more insistent, as though they were calling me from a far distance. I could hear my brother, my father, even my old childhood friends, their voices melding together into a cacophony of fear and confusion. It was all too much to bear. I tried to take another step back, but the mist pressed in around me, the figures closing in. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Alex, why won't you come? It was Ben's voice again, this time coming from everywhere, surrounding me, suffocating me. The fog was thick now, its presence overwhelming. The shapes in the mist were no longer just shadows, they were tangible, their movements smooth and unnatural. They had depth. They felt real. But I couldn't allow myself to believe it. I had to escape. With a burst of adrenaline, I pushed forward, ignoring the whispers, ignoring the figures. I had to fight through. The fog felt heavier now, as if it were reaching out, trying to pull me back. The shapes of my family and friends blurred around me, their voices blending together, each one a mix of longing, confusion, and terror. Alex, don't leave us, the voices pleaded, but it wasn't them. It wasn't my family. It couldn't be. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stop. The figures and their voices faded as I pushed through the thickening fog. I wasn't sure if they were still following me, or if I had simply run so deep into the swamp that I was losing my mind. I needed to get out. I had to. But the swamp was no longer just a place. It was a trap. And I was its prey. The fog was thick, wrapping around me like an endless, suffocating grip. I could barely see, could barely breathe. Each step I took felt like I was wading through some heavy, unseen force, pulling me deeper into the swamp. The shadows, those twisted figures, were gone for now. But the silence was worse. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence. It was the kind that pressed in on you, making you feel like you were the last living thing in the world. The kind of silence that gnawed at your soul, telling you that something was wrong. Something was always watching, always waiting. And then, the voices began again. "Alex, where are you?" The voice was so clear, so familiar, it made my stomach twist. My mother's voice. It was coming from somewhere deep within the mist, so close it felt like she was standing right next to me. Her tone was gentle, worried. She always had that way of calling my name when she was concerned. The way she'd call when I'd been out too late as a child, when she'd been waiting up for me. "Alex, don't go out there. Please." My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled back, my pulse racing, my heart thumping painfully against my chest. "No, no, no," I muttered, my voice breaking. I clutched my head in my hands, trying to block it out, trying to shut it out. But the voice didn't stop. It kept calling, again and again, the words getting louder, more frantic with each passing moment. "Alex, come back." I turned in every direction, looking for her, hoping to see her face, hear her comforting words. But there was nothing. Just the endless mist. Just the shadows of trees reaching out toward me. My hands shook, my mind scrambling for a rational explanation, anything to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be her. But then I heard another voice. "Alex? Are you lost?" Then, my brother's voice. It was almost as if I could feel him standing next to me, his presence so strong it was as if he had never left. He had always had that tone, the teasing kind of voice, the one he used when he'd get annoyed with me for being too serious, for thinking too much. He'd say it when we were kids, when I'd worry about something ridiculous, and he'd laugh it off. "Ben?" My voice cracked. "Ben, is that you?" "Of course it's me, Alex," he said, laughing lightly, the familiar sound of his chuckle echoing in the fog. "You're not lost, are you?" The laughter, so natural, so alive, was like a knife through my chest. The pain, the guilt, the grief, it all came flooding back in an instant. I had lost him. I had lost everything. My chest tightened, my breathing shallow, as I looked around, hoping, praying that I would see his face. But nothing. Nothing except the thick fog and the endless stretch of trees. My pulse quickened, the panic rising like a tidal wave. I took off running again, my legs barely carrying me forward. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't. The swamp had become a labyrinth, its maze twisting and turning with every step I took, leading me further into the darkness, into the depths of my own mind. And still, the voices called. "Alex, where are you? Alex, please. Don't leave us." Each voice sounded like it came from a different direction, overlapping and blending together until it was impossible to tell which one was real, if any of them were. I had to get out. I had to survive. I couldn't let them pull me back. I couldn't let the swamp swallow me whole like it had swallowed so many others. Alex, we're waiting for you. The voices were relentless now, rising in volume, drowning out every other sound. The whispers of my family, my friends, they filled my ears, filling me with a growing dread. I wasn't sure if they were real or if I was losing my mind. Were they in my head? Were they here in the swamp with me, waiting to drag me down into its depths? The mist shifted, swirling around me, and I felt the ground beneath my feet sink further into the muck. My knees buckled, and I stumbled to the ground, the weight of the swamp pressing down on me. No! No! I shouted, but my voice was drowned out by the rising chorus of voices. I had to stand. I had to move. I pushed myself up, my legs trembling beneath me, but the voices were too much. They swarmed around me, pulling at my mind, pulling at my sanity. I couldn't escape them. They were everywhere. Everywhere, always just out of reach. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the fog. I froze. The silhouette was clear now, sharp and distinct. I knew who it was before I even saw its face. It was my father. "Alex, it's time to come home," he said in that deep, calm voice I remembered from childhood. His words were so soft, so inviting. But his face was hidden, obscured by the mist, just like the others. "Dad," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Is that really you?" The figure stepped closer, the fog parting for him. I could feel the pull of his presence, that magnetic warmth I had once felt when I was a child. But something was wrong. His outline, the way he moved, wasn't right. He was too still, too perfect, too empty. I couldn't breathe. The panic overtook me completely, and I turned and ran again. My feet were slipping, my head spinning, but the voices, those voices, they didn't stop. They followed me, calling my name, begging me to come closer, telling me I was safe. But they weren't real. They couldn't be. The swamp had become my prison, and there was no way out. The mist swirled thicker now, suffocating the space around me, turning the air into a stifling blanket. My breath came in sharp, shallow gasps as I stumbled through the thick muck, my legs barely carrying me forward. The weight of the swamp seemed to press down on me from all sides, dragging me deeper into its grip. The voices hadn't stopped. They were louder now, almost deafening, echoing in my mind as much as they were in the mist. I had to focus. I had to escape. But no matter how fast I ran, how far I tried to distance myself from the figures, the voices always followed. It was as though the swamp was playing some twisted game with me, tossing me back into the past, forcing me to relive my greatest regrets. The figures were more than just shadows now. They were memories, reanimated. First King Ben. I saw him standing in front of me, just ahead in the thick fog, his outline so clear, so painfully familiar. He looked like he had the first time we went camping together, back when we were still kids. His eyes, the same bright blue, the same grin that always seemed to have a hint of mischief in it. The one that used to make me laugh even when I didn't want to. "Ben," my voice broke as I stepped closer, my heart hammering in my chest. "Don't you remember, Alex?" Ben said, his voice soft, calm, but there was an edge to it, something sharper. Something darker. My chest tightened as the memory flooded back. The accident. The way I had felt when I found out. How I had blamed myself. How I had told myself that I should have been there, that if I had been more responsible, maybe Ben would still be here. But I hadn't been. I had been stupid, carefree, thinking I was invincible. And now it was too late. I should have been there for you, Ben, I whispered, my eyes welling up. I should have saved you. Ben smiled that same familiar grin, but it was different now, twisted, mocking. His face grew darker, as if the very mist were pulling the life from it. Isn't it funny, Alex? You were the one who let me down. You were the one who couldn't save me. I stepped back, my heart pounding painfully in my chest. No, that's not true. But it was true. A part of me knew it. I had been selfish, careless, and I hadn't been there when he needed me most. The fog shifted, and the figure of Ben dissolved into the mist. But it didn't leave me. No, it followed me. His voice echoed in the distance, a constant reminder of what I had failed to do. And as I walked, the voices of others began to surface. First came my father's voice, the deep, calm tone that always made me feel safe when I was younger. Alex, he called softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. You let him go. My father. The man who had always been my rock, the one who had taught me how to be strong, how to fight through the pain. But I couldn't shake the guilt that had eaten at me since Ben's death. I had been so focused on my own grief, my own life, that I hadn't been there for my father when he needed me. I hadn't been there when he had gotten sick, when he had needed me most. I could see him now, his tired eyes staring at me through the fog, the lines on his face deepening with each year that had passed since I last saw him. He looked older, frailer, but he wasn't the same man. Not now. You abandoned me too, Alex, he said softly. You always ran. I didn't know what to say. He was right, wasn't he? I had run. I had left, and I hadn't looked back. I had been too wrapped up in my own life, in my own struggles, to see what was happening to him. And now, I could never go back. The figure of my father flickered and vanished into the mist, but the voice stayed. It lingered in my ears, like a constant reminder of my failure, my inability to be the son he needed. And then, the worst memory of all surfaced. It wasn't a voice. It was a feeling, a heavy, suffocating weight. The guilt of not saying goodbye. Of not being there when she needed me most. I could feel her now, my mother. I didn't see her, but I felt her presence in the very air, like a suffocating blanket wrapped around me. Her absence was like a hole in my chest, a void that nothing could ever fill. I had left. I had let her go without ever saying what I needed to say. Without ever telling her how much I loved her. Alex, her voice whispered, just behind me. You left me. I spun around, my heart racing, my breath quick and shallow, but there was nothing there. The mist shifted, the shadows of the trees whispered their secrets, and the voices carried on, fading in and out of my thoughts. But the feeling stayed. The crushing weight of loss, of things unsaid, of things I could never take back. The figures in the fog were no longer just memories. They were accusations. They were the ghosts of everything I had failed to do, every moment I had let slip through my fingers. Every regret I had pushed to the back of my mind had come rushing forward now, each one more suffocating than the last. And there was no escape. The swamp had become my past, and it was closing in on me. The fog wrapped tighter around me, its cold fingers creeping under my skin, chilling me to the bone. My legs buckled beneath me, my body finally betraying me after hours of running, of fighting against the pull of the swamp of the past. I fell hard into the muck, my hands sinking into the wet, sticky earth as if the swamp itself was trying to swallow me whole. I couldn't move. The weight of everything crushed me. The voices, the accusations, the memories, the guilt pounded in my skull, each one louder than the last. The trees, the mist, the shadows all blurred together until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. My head spun, my chest felt as though it was being squeezed by invisible hands, and the cold, suffocating embrace of the swamp seemed to pull me deeper into its grasp. I couldn't breathe. I gasped, trying to inhale, but the air felt thick, like it was clogged with something dark and heavy. My heart raced, my body shaking as I lay there, trapped, feeling the weight of my own failures. There was no escape. The swamp had me, just like it had taken so many others before me. There was nowhere to go. No one was coming. "I'm sorry," I whispered to no one in particular, my voice barely audible over the deafening silence. "I'm so sorry." The swamp didn't answer. It never did. It just took. I closed my eyes, feeling the hot sting of tears well up. I had always prided myself on being strong, on being able to handle anything. But now I was nothing. A broken, weak man, lying in the mud, unable to escape the consequences of my own mistakes. Ben's face flashed in front of me again, twisted in that mocking grin, his eyes filled with that unbearable disappointment. "You couldn't save me," he had said. "You were too weak." I could see my father's face too, his tired, sad eyes. The shame in his voice as he told me I had abandoned him. And my mother. Her voice, soft and distant, but filled with the same hurt, the same disappointment. "You left me, Alex." I couldn't hold it in any longer. The tears spilled down my face, mingling with the dirt and the grime of the swamp. My chest heaved as sobs racked my body. The despair, the guilt, the overwhelming sense of loss consumed me. I had failed them. I had failed everyone. I had failed myself. There was nothing left. No reason to go on. No reason to try. What was the point of surviving this swamp of shadows and regrets, if I could never undo what I had done? The mistakes. The lost time. The things I could never take back. The people I could never bring back. I let out a broken laugh, bitter and hollow. The swamp had won. It had pulled me under, just as it had done to so many others. And I had nothing left to fight with. I could feel the weight of the swamp pulling me deeper, the cold water creeping into my clothes, soaking through until I was completely submerged in the muck. My body felt heavy, weighed down by the swamp's suffocating embrace. My mind, too, felt clouded, suffocated by the crushing pressure of my own grief and guilt. There was nothing left. No strength. No hope. I had nothing. I closed my eyes, ready to give in to the swamp's dark embrace. I was done. I had failed. It was over. But then, through the suffocating darkness, I heard something. A voice. Not a voice from the past. Not a whispering shadow. But something else. A distant, haunting sound, as if someone were calling from the very edge of my consciousness. Alex. It was a single word, whispered on the wind, but it cut through the fog, through the darkness, and for a moment, I thought I could hear it clearly. Was it Ben? Was it my father? Was it my mother? No. It wasn't any of them. The voice was something else entirely. It was more of a presence, a pull, a force that reached out to me through the thick, oppressive fog. It was soft, but there was strength in it. It wasn't accusing me. It wasn't mocking me. It wasn't reminding me of my failures. It was just calling me. I opened my eyes, blinking through the tears, through the fog. The swamp seemed to shift just slightly, as though the very landscape was alive, listening to the call. Alex, you have to fight. The voice wasn't as clear as before, but it was real. It was there. I didn't know who it was, but for the first time in what felt like hours, I felt a flicker of something other than despair. A small flame of hope. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know if I could even move. But I knew one thing. If I stayed here, if I let the swamp claim me, then I would be lost forever. And I wasn't ready to be lost. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold, dirty water fill my lungs, but I fought. I fought to push myself up out of the muck, to stand, to move. I didn't know where the strength came from. Maybe it was from the voice that had called me. Maybe it was from the last remnants of who I used to be before the swamp, before the guilt. But whatever it was, I was going to use it. I had to. I pushed against the ground, my hands slipping in the mud, but I forced myself up, forcing my legs to carry me, even though I could barely feel them anymore. I had to keep going. I couldn't give in. Not yet. I wasn't ready to let the swamp take me. Not yet. The swamp was a suffocating abyss, its endless shadows pressing against me from all sides. But as I staggered through the muck, something changed, just for a moment. Up ahead, through the dense fog and twisted branches, I saw it. A flicker. A glimmer. A soft light, small but steady, like the distant glow of a candle in the darkness. My heart skipped a beat. Was it real? Or was it another trick, another cruel illusion from the swamp? I couldn't tell. The swamp had played games with my mind before, leading me down paths that only spiraled deeper into madness, but this felt different. There was something about that light that seemed genuine. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. It was too far to reach in an instant, but it was close enough that I felt a spark of hope surge through me. For the first time in what felt like hours, I dared to believe. I dared to think that maybe, just maybe, I could find my way out of this nightmare. I forced myself to move toward it, ignoring the pains of exhaustion that tugged at my every step. My legs felt like lead, my body still heavy with the swamp's cold embrace, but I couldn't stop now. I couldn't. Now I could see a way out. With every step, the light seemed to grow brighter, clearer. The mist around me thinned, and the oppressive weight on my chest lightened. The sounds of the swamp, those terrible whispers, those voices that had tormented me, faded into the distance. I pushed on, my breath shallow and quick, the weight of the swamp slowly lifting with each step toward the light. There was no way I was turning back. I couldn't. Just a little further, I thought. Just a little more. The light beckoned me like a lighthouse in a storm, its warmth reaching out to me. I could almost feel the relief already, could almost taste the safety that awaited on the other side of whatever this was. But the closer I got, the more something seemed off. I didn't want to admit it. I didn't want to acknowledge the sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach that had started to resurface. My feet moved faster, but my mind screamed at me to slow down, to think this through. I ignored it. I couldn't stop now. Almost there. The light was so close now I could almost touch it, and yet, with every step, a strange unease washed over me. Something wasn't right. My mind fought against the relief, a warning ringing somewhere deep within me. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't let the swamp win again. Just a little more, I thought desperately. And then, just as I reached out toward it, the light flickered. It dimmed. For the briefest moment, I thought it had vanished, but no, there it was again, like a mirage, faint but still present. And in that moment, everything shifted. The swamp seemed to tighten around me again, as though it was waking up from a deep slumber. The air grew thick, the temperature dropped, and a shadow, no, a figure, appeared in the light, blocking my path. It was too late to turn back. The swamp had me. And the light? It was never meant to lead me out. It was just another trap. I stumbled forward, my steps heavy and unsure. The glow had vanished, slipping into the fog like a fleeting dream. But as the world around me shifted, I felt something unsettling, like I was being pulled, drawn back into the very heart of the swamp that had already broken me. The mist thickened again, the shadows closing in, and as I looked around, something made my stomach drop. I recognized this place. The twisted trees. The thick, murky water. The smell of decay that lingered in the air. It was all too familiar, but something was wrong. I should have been miles away from here by now, but instead, I had somehow ended up back where it all started. And then I saw it. There, in the distance, half submerged in the swamp's dark waters, was my kayak. The very same one I had been in when this nightmare began. The boat was overturned, resting awkwardly on the muddy bank, just as it had been when I first lost control. My heart sank, and I stood frozen for a long moment, trying to comprehend the impossible. I had followed the light. I had believed that I was escaping, that I was leaving all this behind. But here it was again. The same spot. The same overturned kayak. No. This couldn't be real. It had to be another trick. A cruel manifestation of the swamp playing with my mind. I shook my head, stepping closer, my breath shallow. But then my eyes caught something that made my blood run cold. Lying beside the kayak, half buried in the wet earth, was the camera I had dropped hours ago. The same camera I had left behind, the one I had never meant to see again. How could it be here? I had left it far back along the way, but now it lay in the exact same spot, as if it had followed me, watching my every move. A chill ran down my spine. I knelt down, my hands trembling as I reached for the camera. The lens was caked in dirt, but when I touched it, I felt a shock of static under my fingers, as if the device itself was alive. I turned the camera over, almost afraid to see what it held. But I had to know. I had to see what I had captured, what I had missed in my frantic flight through the swamp. The screen flickered on, and I froze. The images were distorted, washed out by the fog, but there was no mistaking it. In the blurry, faded photographs, I saw faces, people I knew. Ben, my brother, his face twisted in a grimace of pain, his eyes hollow and accusing. My mother, her features softened with sorrow, standing at the edge of the frame. And then there was something else. Something that shouldn't have been there. A shadow, just a figure, standing in the background, its shape vague and shifting, like it was trying to mimic someone or something. I gasped and dropped the camera. It landed with a soft thud in the muck, the screen facing up, but I couldn't look at it anymore. The swamp had followed me. It had drawn me back, made me think I was escaping when in reality it had been pulling me deeper into its grasp from the very start. I was back where it all began. The kayak. The camera. the swamp. It had all come full circle. And this time, there would be no way out. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, staring at the overturned kayak and the camera on the ground. The swamp had twisted everything around me. I had no idea how I ended up back here, but it didn't matter. The air was thick with the smell of decay, the dampness of the swamp clinging to my skin. And then, I heard it. A soft murmur, like a distant hum, a collection of voices that seemed to rise out of the very earth beneath me. My blood turned to ice, but I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The voices grew louder, clearer, each one distinct, yet overlapping, like an echo bouncing off every tree, every patch of water. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that my mind was just breaking under the pressure of everything I'd seen and felt. But deep down, I knew. It wasn't my imagination. The swamp was speaking to me. Then, just beyond the kayak, figures began to materialize. At first, there were shadows in the fog, indistinct forms rising from the mist. But slowly, painfully, they solidified, becoming more and more real with each passing second. And they were all watching me. My legs felt like lead, and for a moment, I thought I might collapse. There were at least a dozen of them, figures standing perfectly still, their faces veiled in darkness. But as the mist parted, I saw their features, one by one. Ben was there. My brother. His face twisted in an expression of pain, his eyes hollow and empty. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His presence was as real as the air I was breathing, yet it felt wrong. His eyes, they weren't just sad, they were accusing. And I had no idea why. I stepped back, my body trembling, but the group of figures remained motionless, waiting. Then I saw her, my mother, standing a few paces to the left. Her face was pale, too pale, her eyes wide with fear. She reached out a hand toward me, but her lips didn't move. No words came from her, yet her eyes, they spoke volumes. The disappointment. The grief. I tried to turn away, but there were more. The faces kept coming. An old friend from high school, someone I hadn't seen in years, his face frozen in a silent scream. Another figure, an ex-girlfriend, her eyes wide with confusion, her mouth frozen in an unspoken question. And then a figure that I didn't recognize, a man whose face was blurred and indistinct, his eyes staring at me with a strange emptiness. Each one was an echo of my past. The faces of people I had loved, people I had lost, people whose deaths had left me broken. Their presence, it felt like they were reaching out to me, pulling me back into the past, into memories I couldn't escape. I could hear their voices, overlapping like a chorus. Ben's voice first, soft and distant. You should have been there. My mother's voice, cracked with sorrow. You couldn't save him. Then my friend's voice, sharp and accusing. Why didn't you try harder? Each voice carried the weight of my guilt, my failure to protect them. But they weren't real. I knew they weren't real. The swamp had taken their faces, their voices, twisted them into something else, something dark, something that wanted to break me. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how far I moved, they stayed, standing in place, watching, waiting. I wanted to scream, to yell at them to leave me alone. But all that came out was a strangled whisper. Why? I didn't know if I was asking them or myself. They didn't answer. They didn't need to. The answer was clear. The swamp had called me here. It had taken the people I loved, and now it was taking me, too. One step at a time, it would drain me dry, mentally, emotionally, until I was nothing but a shadow, like them. And just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the voices stopped. Silence. I stood there, gasping for breath, my head spinning. The figures didn't move. They didn't speak. But I knew they were waiting for me to join them, to become one of them. They weren't the ones who had died. It was me. I was the one who was lost. And I couldn't find my way back. Not now. Not after everything the swamp had shown me. I turned around, my mind numb, and started walking away, not knowing where I was going, but knowing I could never go back. Not to the way things were. I had entered the swamp as a man, but I would leave as something else entirely. The swamp had already claimed my soul. And as I walked into the darkness, the voices began again, soft, insistent, always whispering my name. I stood frozen, my mind racing, my heart pounding in my chest. The voices had quieted, leaving only the steady pulse of fear that thrummed through my veins. The figures, those shadows from my past, were still there, unmoving, but I couldn't look at them any longer. I couldn't bear to see the faces of people I loved, people I had failed. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A soft glow, like a distant star, piercing the suffocating fog. It flickered, faint at first, but as I squinted, it grew brighter. A beacon, promising escape, an end to the terror that had gripped me for what felt like an eternity. It was a light, a real light, not a trick of the swamp. For a moment, I felt a strange relief. This was it. The way out. The exit I had been desperately searching for. Maybe it was the end of the nightmare. Maybe I would finally be free. But as I took a step forward, I hesitated. Something didn't feel right. The light was too perfect, too inviting. I had seen this before, in flashes of memory, in the faces of the people I'd lost. The light was never an escape. It was always a lure, a trap, drawing me deeper into the swamp's clutches. The swamp wanted me. It wanted me to come closer, to give in. I glanced over my shoulder at the figures, my heart wrenching in my chest. Then, my mother. All of them, standing motionless, waiting, their eyes fixed on me, pulling me back toward them. Toward the past I couldn't escape. Could I face them again? Could I walk back into the suffocating darkness of the swamp and try to find my way out? Or was this the only way forward, the light, however deceiving it might be, a false promise of peace? My breath caught in my throat as I realized the truth. I had already been here too long. The swamp had already claimed too much of me. If I stayed, I might disappear forever. If I went toward the light, I might lose everything I had left of myself. But was there even anything left to lose? The figures whispered again, their voices like a cold wind in my ear, their words wrapping around my mind like a vice. You can't run away from your past. You can't escape what you've done. You belong here. I stepped back, my heart racing, every instinct in my body telling me to turn around and run, to flee into the dark swamp. But the light was so close. The decision felt like an anchor pulling me, heavier with each passing second. I looked at the glowing light again. It was still there, shimmering, offering me something that felt almost like salvation. But deep down, I knew what it was. The swamp had shown me everything it wanted me to see. It had given me the faces of the past, the voices of my regrets, the choices I couldn't take back. The swamp didn't want me to leave. It wanted to keep me, to break me. I could feel the cold grip of it again, wrapping tighter around my chest. I had to decide. I had to choose. I closed my eyes, breathing in the damp air. The swamp was alive around me, suffocating, always shifting. But the light was only one more trick. I couldn't trust it. I couldn't trust anything anymore. With a final, desperate breath, I turned away from the light and faced the darkness of the swamp once more. The thick fog rolled around me, pressing in like a wall, but I stepped forward anyway, my feet sinking into the soft earth. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I knew I had to fight, had to keep moving. The swamp had claimed so much already, but I wasn't ready to let it take everything. Not yet. I pushed through the fog, my heart pounding, my mind screaming for me to turn back. But I kept going. One step after another, deeper into the void, hoping that somewhere, somehow, I might find my way out. And yet, as the voices rose again, louder now, twisting in my head, I knew there was no escaping this place. There was no way out. I was already lost. And as I stumbled deeper into the swamp's heart, the light behind me dimmed to nothing, leaving only the whispers of the crowd to guide my steps. I kept moving. The weight of my decision pressed heavily on my chest as I trudged through the thick swamp, my every step sinking deeper into the mud. The light, that fleeting illusion of salvation, was gone now, swallowed by the impenetrable fog that surrounded me. I had chosen to run, to escape the pull of the past, to fight against whatever dark force had laid claim to this place. But the swamp wasn't finished with me. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I had been alone here for so long, wandering through an endless maze of trees and mist. But then I heard it. A faint rustle behind me. Not the usual sounds of the swamp, the creaking of trees, the call of distant birds, but something different. It was more deliberate. Like something or someone was following me. I spun around, my heart thudding in my chest, but there was nothing. Just the fog, swirling in lazy patterns around me, the trees standing still and silent in the distance. Just the swamp, I muttered to myself, forcing the words out, as if saying them would somehow calm the growing anxiety creeping over me. But the whispers, those voices, were still there, lingering just out of reach, like a murmur that I could never quite understand. And then, I heard it again. A soft, dragging sound. A step in the mist. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I had to be imagining it. There was no one out here. No one but me. I had to be losing my mind. I had to. But then I saw it, just a flicker in the fog. A shape, standing tall and motionless, at the edge of my vision. I turned my head quickly, but there was nothing. Nothing but the thickening mist and the looming trees. I turned back the way I was heading, trying to push down the rising panic. But it was too late. The fog, no, it wasn't just the fog anymore, it was moving with me. It was following me. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible. The edges of the mist seemed to curl in, drawing closer, hugging my steps. But as I kept moving, the fog grew thicker, more oppressive, as if it were actively closing in on me. The familiar, comforting disorientation of the swamp had shifted. The quiet, still atmosphere was replaced by a constant pressure in the air, a feeling like something unseen was just behind me, watching. Every breath felt heavier, each step seemed to take more effort. I glanced over my shoulder again, half expecting to see something or someone standing there. But there was still nothing. Only the fog, thick and suffocating, creeping in from all directions. But now, the fog wasn't just surrounding me, it was closing in, forming tendrils that snaked around the trees, the ground, like fingers that reached out to pull me in. The whispers intensified. "Come back," they hissed. "You can't escape. You belong to us now." I stumbled, tripping over a root, but quickly regained my balance. I couldn't stop. I couldn't let the fog catch me. I had to keep moving. The swamp had already taken so much, and I wasn't going to let it take me too. But the deeper I went, the worse it became. The air was thick with the oppressive weight of the mist, and the trees, once distant and ghostly, now loomed close, their twisted branches reaching out like arms. Every direction felt the same. The fog was everywhere, closing in tighter with every step I took. I thought I saw something ahead, movement, a figure emerging from the mist. My heart skipped a beat, but it was just another illusion, a trick of the swamp's twisted landscape. The faces of my past flashed in my mind, Ben, my mother, my friends, each one urging me to come closer, pulling me deeper into the mire. The voices began again, louder now, overlapping, desperate. They wanted me to stop, to turn around, to give in. But I couldn't. I couldn't let it win. But then, I saw it. Just ahead, in the mist, another light. A flicker. It wasn't the same as before, but it was unmistakable. The promise of something different. Something real. The light was moving. It wasn't still, like the last one. It pulsed, shifting in and out of view, like it was beckoning me. I couldn't tell if it was the swamp or my desperation that made it so tempting. I took a step toward it, my body moving before my mind could stop it. But as I did, the fog seemed to surge forward, rushing in faster than I could react. I tried to push through it, to fight against it, but the mist was everywhere now. It was no longer just following me, it was swallowing me whole. With every breath, the air grew colder. I couldn't see the path anymore, couldn't see anything but the swirling white around me. My skin prickled with an unnatural chill, my senses overwhelmed by the damp, oppressive fog. The world had narrowed down to nothing but this. And then I understood. The fog wasn't just following me. It was part of me now. It had become my new reality. Every step I took, every decision I made, had brought me closer to this point where the swamp and I were one. The past, the present, the swamp, the fog, it all bled together, twisting into something I could no longer separate. I wasn't escaping anymore. I had never truly been free. The swamp had claimed me, body and soul. And now, as the fog surrounded me, I knew I would never leave. I had become part of the mist, part of the swamp, lost to it forever. There was no escape. Only the whispers and the darkness. Forever. The fog had completely enveloped me now. I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard a sound. The usual buzz of insects, the rustling of leaves in the wind, even the distant croak of frogs, everything had disappeared. The swamp, which once teemed with life, was now unnervingly silent, as though it had become a world all its own, frozen in time. I couldn't tell if I was still in the physical world anymore. The air was too thick, too suffocating. My breath came in shallow gasps, the fog pressing in so close I could barely see my hand in front of my face. Every step felt like wading through water, as if the very ground beneath me had become soft, giving weight under my weight, pulling me down into the depths. The silence pressed against me, wrapping around my mind. It felt unnatural, wrong. Silence wasn't normal in a swamp. Even in the darkest, most isolated places, there was always some noise, some sign of life. But here, nothing. I swallowed hard, trying to push through the rising panic that was clawing at my chest. The swamp had already taken my reality, and now it was taking my senses, too. Was I losing my mind? Had I already crossed over to whatever twisted world the swamp had created? I stopped walking, unsure of where I was or where I was going. The fog had swallowed the landscape entirely, leaving me with nothing but a void that stretched endlessly in every direction. This isn't real. This can't be real, I thought, trying to convince myself, but the words didn't carry the weight they once had. They sounded hollow in my head, like the last whispers of a person who had already given up. The silence continued, suffocating, filling the space around me. But somewhere deep inside, a cold realization began to settle in. I'm not in the world I once knew. The swamp had become something else, something that played with time, with space, with perception itself. It had twisted everything, and now I was no longer sure where the swamp ended and I began. The quiet was shattered by a sudden movement, a shadow darting across the thick, suffocating fog. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up in terror. The air seemed to crackle with a sense of danger, and I could feel it closing in on me, like 1,000 unseen eyes watching my every move. Then, without warning, the first figure lunged at me from the mist. I didn't have time to react. It was like a part of the fog itself, its body blending with the swirling light until it was just an outline of something dark and jagged, reaching for me with long, grasping arms. Its face was a blur, nothing but a shadowy void that seemed to suck in the light, and its mouth, wide and gaping, revealed rows of twisted, broken teeth. I staggered back, my heart pounding in my chest. I barely had time to react before another figure appeared, and then another, dark, contorted shapes, each one more horrifying than the last, emerging from the thick fog that surrounded me. They moved with unnatural speed, their arms stretching, hands clawing for me, like they were trying to drag me into the very mist they were born from. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on the uneven ground, and I fell hard, my body slamming into the cold, muddy earth. But there was no time to stay down. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, breath shallow and panicked. The figures were coming closer now, their gnarled hands reaching out as their bodies seemed to writhe and twist in unnatural ways. I didn't think. I didn't have time. All I could do was fight for my life. My hand shot out, grabbing a large, jagged branch that had fallen nearby, its surface slick with moisture. I swung it at the first figure that lunged, the weight of the wood connecting with its chest, knocking it back. But it didn't fall. It didn't even flinch. Instead, it screeched, a low, guttural noise that sent a shiver down my spine, and moved toward me even faster. I swung again, this time catching it across the face, and for a moment, I thought it was gone. But as soon as I looked up, I saw more figures closing in, surrounding me, their hands reaching for me, their forms shifting, blurring, like they were trying to overwhelm me with their numbers. Each figure that reached for me felt like it was pulling at my soul, dragging me deeper into the fog. The more I fought, the more I realized these weren't just things trying to hurt me. They were trying to take something from me, something I couldn't fully understand. I took another swing at one of the figures, but this time it grabbed the branch mid-swing, jerking it out of my hands with terrifying strength. Before I could react, the creature lunged at me, its face distorting in an almost mocking way, a twisted grin stretching across its featureless face. I kicked, flailing my legs as the figure loomed over me. I could feel its cold, damp hands closing around my arm, its grip unyielding, pulling me toward the mist. Panic surged through me, and I yanked my arm away, scrambling to my feet. No. No, I'm not going to let it take me. I couldn't let them win. I couldn't let them drag me into this nightmare. I had to get out of here. I had to. Suddenly, the swamp seemed to warp around me. The ground beneath my feet shifted, as if it were no longer solid, and I slipped again, falling to my knees. The creatures were closing in. There was no escape. They were too many, too fast. Then, through the thick fog, I saw something else. A faint light, flickering weakly in the distance. The same light I had seen before. It was moving again. Was it the same illusion, or was it real? I didn't know. But it was my only chance. With all my remaining strength, I pushed myself up, ignoring the pain in my legs, ignoring the cold fingers that brushed against my skin as the shadowy figures closed in around me. I ran. I didn't look back. The mist swirled around me, but I forced my eyes on that flickering light, hoping it was my salvation. My heart raced, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I sprinted, desperate to reach it before the darkness consumed me completely. I collapsed onto the small island, my heart thundering in my chest as I gasped for breath. My legs felt like they were made of stone, aching from the sprint through the bog, but I couldn't afford to stop. I couldn't afford to rest. The light had led me here, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I found myself standing on solid ground. The island was small, no bigger than a modest clearing in the swamp. Tall, gnarled trees lined its edges, their branches twisted and bent as though they, too, had fallen prey to the swamp's insidious pull. The air here was still, and the fog seemed to hold its breath, like it was waiting for something, waiting for me to slip up, to make a mistake. I looked around, scanning my surroundings, but the suffocating silence made it impossible to get a clear sense of where I was. It felt like the fog had swallowed not just the sound, but the very essence of the world itself. I could no longer hear the distant calls of birds or the rustling of leaves. There was only the oppressive stillness and the feeling that something, someone, was watching me from the shadows. I sat on the damp ground, my back against one of the twisted trees. I didn't know how long I had been running or how far I had come. Time seemed to have lost its meaning here. I closed my eyes for a moment, allowing myself to breathe, allowing myself to feel the smallest shred of relief. But I knew better. I knew that peace was fleeting here. The swamp had already proven its cruelty, and it wasn't about to give up on me just yet. I could feel the weight of that truth pressing against my chest, an invisible hand tightening around my heart. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. The figures, the voices, the faces, my brother, my friend, all the people I'd lost. Were they real? Or had I lost my grip on reality entirely? Was I trapped in a nightmare, or was this place something worse? The light, the one I had followed so desperately, had brought me here, but now that I was here, it felt hollow. There was no warmth to it. No promise of safety. I glanced down at the water lapping at the shore, the mist swirling around me, and I felt the deep, gnawing sense that this wasn't over. The swamp wasn't finished with me. It wasn't finished with any of us. I stood up, wiping the mud off my pants, my legs trembling with exhaustion. The fog seemed to press in closer, as if eager to drag me back into its depths. I glanced around, knowing it wouldn't be long before the shadowy figures would return, but I couldn't stay here. I had to keep moving. There was no other choice. I had barely taken a step when I saw him. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The mist shifted, swirling like a living thing, and for a fleeting moment, the world around me seemed to stretch and bend. Then, emerging from the fog, too real, too close, there he was. Ben. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest as his figure slowly took shape before me. He looked the same as he had before the accident, his familiar smile, the way his eyes sparkled with that mischievous glint that always made me feel like everything would be okay. But this time, there was something off. Something wrong about the way he stood, like he wasn't fully there. "Alex," he said, his voice so clear it made my throat tighten. "You've come so far. You're almost there. Just trust me. I can get you out of here. I can help you." The words hit me like a wave, washing away the exhaustion and fear for a moment. I felt a flicker of hope, something I hadn't allowed myself to feel since that day. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. I had been running, fighting, struggling, and maybe this was the answer. Maybe, if I just listened, everything would be okay. "Ben," my voice caught in my throat. I took a step forward, my body trembling, my heart in my throat. "I don't know if I can do this. I'm not sure what's real anymore." Ben's smile deepened, and his eyes softened in that way that only he could. "I know, Alex. I know it's hard. But you don't have to fight anymore. I'm here. I've always been here. Just trust me, and we can leave this place together." The words rang in my ears, and for a moment, I felt a warm rush of relief. He was offering me an escape, a way out of this nightmare. All I had to do was trust him, to believe in him. Just like I used to, back when we were kids, when nothing seemed impossible. When I could count on him to always make things better. But something lingered in the back of my mind, a whisper I couldn't shake. A gut feeling that told me this wasn't right. I looked at Ben, really looked at him, and my blood ran cold. There was something wrong with his eyes. They were too wide, too empty. His skin looked pale, almost gray, and the smile he wore seemed stretched, forced. The more I looked at him, the more the illusion began to break down. "Ben," I whispered, stepping back, my voice trembling. "No, something's wrong. This isn't you." He tilted his head, and his smile never faltered. But the air around him grew colder, heavier, like the swamp itself was closing in on me. "You don't have to be afraid, Alex. I'm here. I can take you away from all this. Just trust me." I shook my head, my heart pounding harder than before. The world around me felt like it was closing in, the fog thickening, the figures in the distance starting to stir again, their shapes becoming more distinct, more real. It was all coming back. "I can't trust you," I said, my voice growing firmer. "You're not him. You're not my brother." For the briefest moment, I thought I saw something flicker behind his eyes, a flash of the brother I had known. But it disappeared in an instant, replaced by the same hollow, unblinking stare. The mist closed in around me, swirling faster now, pulling at my feet, clawing at my body. The shadows reached out, like the swamp itself was trying to consume me whole. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, my voice shaking but resolute. Ben's face contorted, his smile twisting into something far darker. "You should be." Before I could react, he lunged, his cold hands reaching for my throat. The swamp roared around me, the world collapsing into chaos. The last thing I saw was the darkness closing in, and the twisted version of my brother's face, now unrecognizable, sneering at me as the fog swallowed me whole. I felt the cold fingers of the apparition close around my wrist, dragging me closer. The suffocating pressure of the mist wrapped tighter, and the swamp seemed to roar louder, the once muted sounds now distorting into a cacophony of whispers and shrieks. Ben, or the thing that looked like him, was no longer offering salvation. He was trying to consume me. The calmness, the comfort he had once brought me was now a lie, a trap. No! I gasped, wrenching my arm free from the ghostly grip. My heart pounded violently in my chest as my legs moved instinctively, backing away. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let myself be dragged into whatever dark corner of this cursed swamp it wanted me to go. The fog thickened, choking the air, and the spectral forms began to move again, circling in the distance, like hungry wolves closing in on their prey. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of fear bear down on me, but something else rose in my chest, something sharper, a burning sense of defiance. This wasn't real. None of this was real. These were lies, these were shadows and whispers preying on my guilt and my grief. I would not fall for it. You're not my brother. I shouted, my voice breaking but filled with more strength than I felt. You can't fool me. You won't have me. The fog seemed to recoil at my words, momentarily clearing. Ben's twisted grin faltered, and I saw the true darkness lurking behind his eyes, the thing that had taken hold of him, of all of them. The swamp wasn't offering me escape. It was offering me surrender, and I was done surrendering. In a split-second decision, without thinking, I turned away from the image of my brother, my former brother, and plunged myself into the thick, murky waters of the swamp. The cold shock of the water engulfed me, sloshing over my head as I gasped for air. I felt the earth below me shift, soft and unstable, and I kicked hard, pushing myself further in, deeper into the unknown, away from the voices and the phantoms. The sounds of the swamp were deafening now, faint splashes from behind, distant murmurs from the ghostly figures, but I focused only on my survival. The tangle of weeds and mud clung to my legs as I fought against the current, trying to ignore the icy chill that was sinking deep into my bones. The water was murky, thick with sediment and decay. I couldn't see much, but I could feel it. The presence of the swamp, the heaviness in the air, was still there, lingering like a dark cloud overhead, but I refused to let it pull me back. I wouldn't stop fighting. The sound of the voices of my past, grew louder. My brother's voice again, pleading, calling my name. But now it was nothing more than a distant echo, distorted by the rush of water and panic in my chest. I kept pushing, kept kicking, not allowing the past to drag me down into the depths. My heart was a wild drumbeat in my chest, but I couldn't stop. I refused to stop. And then, the most terrifying thought struck me as I fought against the swamp's pull. What if it was too late? What if the swamp had already claimed me, and this was just another illusion, another trap? I couldn't dwell on that now. All I could do was fight, because if I didn't, the swamp would win. And if it won, I wouldn't be the one to walk away. I let out a scream into the murky water, and with all the strength I had left, I pushed forward, hoping against hope that somewhere, somehow, I would escape. I gasped as I awoke, my body jerking upright, heart racing in my chest. The swamp was silent now. No whispers, no shadows, no lurking figures. The air felt cold against my damp skin, and for a moment, I thought I was still in the depths of the swamp, still fighting against the crushing pull of the water. But then I realized I was lying on solid ground. The soft earth beneath me was dry, the faint scent of decay lingering but distant. I looked around. The trees stood eerily still, their gnarled branches swaying in the faint breeze. The mist had cleared, leaving only the overgrown, muddy ground around me. There was no sign of the haunting figures, no Ben calling my name. Just the oppressive silence of the swamp, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. I reached up to rub my face, feeling the cold sting of water on my cheeks. But as my fingers brushed against my skin, I froze. Something wasn't right. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling, slick with what looked like mud, but when I examined them closely, I realized with a sickening jolt that the marks were darker. Like shadowy impressions, like remnants of something, someone, clinging to my skin. The shadows, those same shadows that had stalked me through the swamp, the ones that whispered and called and mimicked the voices of my lost loved ones, had left a mark. A lingering imprint, something deep inside me that wasn't going to fade so easily. My breath hitched as I looked at my arms. The skin was bruised, mottled with dark streaks, like the after effects of a deep wound. But the more I looked, the more I realized that it wasn't just physical damage. It was inside me, too. Something had changed. I stumbled to my feet, my legs weak and unsteady. My body ached from exhaustion, but my mind was the worst part. It felt foggy, fractured, as if something had been stolen from me, some part of myself had slipped away. Had I really escaped? Or had I simply walked deeper into the nightmare? I wiped my hands on my pants, trying to shake off the feeling of them still being marked. The echoes of the voices, the faces of the phantoms, haunted me now more than ever. Ben's face, distorted in the fog, his twisted words ringing in my ears. They weren't gone. They were still here. They were inside me. As I stumbled forward, my mind reeling, I heard a sound in the distance, a whisper. Soft at first, but growing louder, more distinct. Alex. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart skipped a beat. It was his voice. Ben's voice. Calling me. I turned in the direction of the sound, my pulse quickening. There, just beyond the tree line, I saw it. A flicker of movement. A shadow, no, another figure, standing there in the distance. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The figure stepped closer. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence. I could feel the weight of it. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, to escape. But I stood there, rooted to the spot, because I knew it wasn't over. The swamp had never let me go. The shadows had marked me, and no matter how far I ran, they would follow. Their voices would never stop. Their faces would never fade. I could feel them closing in on me, their cold fingers reaching out from the corners of my mind. Alex. The voice repeated, this time closer, more urgent. I turned slowly, unwilling to acknowledge the truth. I tried to breathe through the rising panic, but my chest was tight, my limbs heavy, like I was sinking once again. Not again. I whispered to myself, but I wasn't sure if I was talking to the ghost or to myself. Because the truth was, I had never really left the swamp. I was still there, drowning in the shadows. The figure reached out, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that it wasn't just my past that was chasing me. It was the swamp itself. The shadows had no intention of letting me go. And no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, they would follow. Forever. I don't remember how I escaped. One moment, I was in the swamp, my mind teetering on the edge of madness, surrounded by shadows, the voices of my past echoing in the fog, and the next, I was here, lying on the edge of the marsh. The air was still, and the faint sounds of the swamp, the chirping of distant insects, and the rustling of the trees seemed almost normal. But nothing felt normal. My mind was fractured, as if I had woken up from a nightmare that I could no longer remember, except the fear still lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. I glanced around, trying to piece together what had happened. How had I made it out? The swamp, its pull, its whispers, was still so vivid in my memory. The oppressive fog, the cold, the feeling of being hunted. But now, everything was eerily quiet. I was on solid ground, but my body felt wrong, like I had never fully left that cursed place. My eyes wandered over my surroundings, but the landscape felt unfamiliar. Was I still in Florida? Had I truly escaped, or had I somehow drifted deeper into the swamp's twisted grip? I shook my head, trying to push the confusion away. But the more I tried to focus, the more the nagging sense of dread crawled under my skin. Something had changed. I had changed. The shadows, the voices, they were still with me. I reached up to touch my face, and my fingers trembled as they brushed against the damp skin of my cheeks. When I looked down at them, I froze. There were marks. Dark, jagged streaks running up my arms and across my hands. The same shadowy marks that had been on my skin before. They weren't just dirt or bruises, they were the remnants of something darker, something that had touched me, something that wouldn't let go. I stumbled to my feet, my legs weak, as though I hadn't used them in days. The air around me felt heavy, pressing down on my chest, suffocating me with the weight of something I couldn't quite name. My breath was shallow, and every time I exhaled, I could hear it, a faint whisper in the air. "Alex, come back." The voice was distant, but it sounded too close. His voice. Ben's voice. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart dropped into my stomach. There was no mistaking it. The voice was clear, unmistakable, and it came from behind me. I turned slowly, half expecting to see him standing there, Ben, with that twisted grin on his face, or the hollow, ghostly version of him that had haunted my every step. But no one was there. Only the silence. The thick, suffocating silence. But the voice kept coming, always at the edge of my hearing, whispering my name over and over again. It was like an insistent, cold hand tugging at my thoughts, dragging me back into the swamp that I thought I had escaped. "Ben?" My voice cracked as I called out, the name escaping my lips before I could stop it. Nothing. The swamp around me was still. But the voices, kept coming, like an echo bouncing off the walls of my mind. Not just Ben's. Others. Faces from my past, friends, family, strangers. All calling to me. All demanding my attention. I took a shaky step forward, my breath coming in short bursts. I couldn't see them, but I could hear them. Could feel them. They were closing in, just beyond the trees, just beyond the reach of my senses. I had tried to escape, but the swamp had never truly let me go. The voices were in my head now, following me, tormenting me from within. The air felt colder, as though I was still standing in the heart of that haunted swamp. And in the depths of my soul, I realized the terrifying truth. I hadn't left the swamp. The swamp had followed me. The change wasn't in the world around me, it was inside me. The mark I carried was more than just a physical wound. The swamp had altered me, taken something from me, and no matter how far I ran, no matter how many times I tried to escape, the echoes would never fade. The voices would follow me, forever. I tried to tell someone. I had to. Maybe, just maybe, if I explained everything, someone would understand. Someone would believe me. I had to tell the story. I had to make them see. But as I sat in that small diner, the sunlight filtering through the grimy windows, my hands trembling over the chipped coffee cup, I realized something unsettling. They didn't believe me. I looked around at the faces in the diner, all familiar with the everyday rhythms of small-town life. The waitress, wiping down the counter, the truck driver hunched over his greasy plate of food, the elderly couple talking in low voices. They were all so normal, so far removed from the nightmare I had lived. I cleared my throat, trying to steady myself, trying to find the words that would make them understand. "You don't know what it's like," I started, my voice shaking despite my efforts to control it. "The swamp, it's not just a place. It's alive. It's haunted." The waitress paused, glanced at me with a half smile, and kept wiping the counter. The truck driver didn't even look up from his food. Only the elderly man at the corner table seemed to notice me. He raised an eyebrow but said nothing. I saw things. Shadows, people, ghosts, I continued, my words spilling out in a desperate attempt to make them understand. I heard my brother's voice. I saw him. But he was twisted, not right. And the swamp, it pulls you in. The elderly man finally spoke, his voice a low drawl that didn't carry much conviction. "Son, you've been through something out there, haven't you? Maybe a little too much time in the heat or the sun. Folks get strange after wandering too long in the marshes." I clenched my fists under the table, the frustration rising in my chest. No, it wasn't like that. It wasn't just some hallucination. It was real. The voices, the faces, they came after me. I reached into my bag, my fingers trembling, and pulled out the old camera. The one I had found on the edge of the swamp, the camera that had once held those blurry, haunting photos of figures in the mist. My last hope to prove I wasn't insane. I slammed it onto the table in front of them. "Look. This camera, this is proof." It had pictures. People, shadows, ghosts. You can see them in the photos. "Please, just look." The waitress glanced at the camera for a moment, then shrugged. "We don't got time for that, sugar. I'm just trying to keep this place open." With a resigned sigh, I pressed the button to open the camera, hoping against hope that maybe, just maybe, there would be something. Something to show them. I stared at the small screen, waiting for the image to load. My heartbeat quickened. There was nothing. No blurry shapes, no haunting figures, no ghostly faces. Only the empty, silent frames of the swamp. The same as any other. I felt the air leave my lungs, my throat closing. The camera had shown nothing. The photos were gone. I flipped through the camera's memory over and over, hoping for even the faintest trace of the faces that had haunted me. But there was nothing. It was as if the swamp had erased all of it. The shadows, the voices, everything gone. "They're gone," I whispered hoarsely, my voice barely audible. "It's all gone." The elderly man looked at me with pity, but it wasn't the kind of pity that made you feel comforted. It was the kind that made you feel small, insignificant. He nodded slowly. "Maybe you should get some rest, son. Sometimes our minds play tricks on us." I tried to speak, but my throat tightened. I wanted to scream, to demand they believe me. But I couldn't. I couldn't even convince myself. I shoved the camera back into my bag, feeling the weight of it like a stone around my neck. The truth, the horror of what I'd experienced, it was there, but it was slipping away. Just like the faces, the voices, the nightmare. It was fading, but it was still there, haunting me in ways that no one could understand. As I stood up and left the diner, I heard them murmuring behind me. They didn't care. They didn't know. But I did. I knew. I was alone with the truth now. Alone with the knowledge that no one would ever believe me, that the swamp was still out there, still calling. Still waiting. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how much I tried to escape, the shadows would always follow. The sun was beginning to set as I walked away from the diner, the heavy weight of defeat pressing down on me. The world felt strangely silent, like the quiet before a storm. As I walked down the empty street, the feeling of being watched crept over me once again. It had been there since I first set foot in that godforsaken swamp, and no matter where I went, it never truly left. I didn't know where I was going anymore. My steps seemed mechanical, like I was on autopilot, unable to turn away from the pull of the memories, the haunting of the swamp. I needed to be rid of it, to be free. But then, as I passed a small, cracked window of a closed cafe, I saw it. There, in the reflection of the glass, was Ben. My heart stopped. My blood ran cold. His face was clear, his features just like I remembered. His eyes, those eyes, looked back at me with an intensity one hadn't seen in years. It wasn't just a fleeting image. It wasn't a trick of the light or the fog. It was him. I could even see the slight tilt of his head, as if he was waiting for me. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat, and for a moment I stood paralyzed, staring into the reflection of the glass. He wasn't supposed to be here. He couldn't be. He was dead. And yet, there he was. His smile, faint but unmistakable, drew me in. It felt so real, so alive, I could almost reach out and touch him. I took a shaky step forward, my hand lifting as if it were being guided by some invisible force. The reflection of Ben in the glass didn't move, but I could feel it pulling me in, urging me closer, like a siren's call that I couldn't resist. He was beckoning me, just as the others had in the swamp, and every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around, to run. But I couldn't. I was drawn to him, like a moth to a flame. I took another step. Then another. The reflection seemed to shift, Ben's smile widening as though he were inviting me into the darkness beyond the window. The image of his face became clearer, more vivid, and the shadows around him deepened. In that moment, everything I had endured, the ghosts in the swamp, the shifting fog, the voices, faded. It was just me and him. It was just Ben. Ben, I whispered, my voice barely audible in the empty street. I could feel my body moving on its own, my legs carrying me closer to the glass, closer to the truth I thought I wanted. Closer to the face of my brother. The brother I had lost. But as I stepped toward the window, a cold chill swept over me. Something in the reflection changed. The smile didn't look the same anymore. It twisted, contorted into something wrong. The eyes, those familiar eyes, were now empty, black pits, staring back at me with malice. I stumbled back, gasping as the reflection of Ben cracked, like shattered glass, and the fragments splintered into nothingness. I stood frozen, staring at the empty window, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure was gone. My brother, the real Ben, was gone. For a long moment, I could only hear my ragged breaths. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I was alone again. And yet, something in my gut told me I wasn't alone. That thing I had seen in the window, whatever it was still out there, waiting. It had taken his face. It had taken everything I had once held dear. I could feel the weight of that truth pressing down on me, suffocating me. The swamp was still there, still calling. It had never really let me go. And the worst part was, I didn't know if I had the strength to resist anymore. The sun rose the next morning, casting a pale light over the still, silent town. It should have been a fresh start, a new day, but instead, it felt like the world was holding its breath. The news traveled fast, as these things often do. The sheriff, a grim-faced man who had been keeping an eye on the troubled tourists in the area, made a quiet announcement to the local reporters. A young man, Alex Green, had gone missing. His belongings were found abandoned on the edge of the swamp, scattered as if left in a hurry. His kayak was upturned and half submerged in the murky water. The camera, the one he had been obsessively carrying, was there too, its lens cracked, its memory card missing. The only thing that remained were the faint, unsettling impressions left by the disturbed earth and the inexplicable sense of absence that followed. The search teams scoured the swamp all day. They trudged through the thick mud, pushing through the heavy mist, calling out for him. But the swamp swallowed every sound, and it swallowed Alex too. They found nothing else. No trace of him. No sign of struggle. The search ended as the sky darkened and the shadows in the swamp stretched long. Nothing but the eerie silence and the endless fog remained. The swamp had claimed another. Weeks passed, and the story faded. People whispered, sure, but life continued on. The swamp was not kind to those who ventured too deep. Stories of missing hikers, lost tourists, and unexplained disappearances were nothing new to the locals. But there was one thing that lingered. A single, odd detail. The night Alex disappeared, just before his belongings were found, someone who lived near the swamp, swore they saw something strange. A figure standing at the edge of the water, just beyond the reach of the trees. It looked like a man, but it didn't move like one. His eyes glinted in the darkness, and for a split second, there was a strange flicker in the air, like the very atmosphere around him had shifted. They said the figure was smiling. By the time they went to investigate, there was no one there. No sign of life. Only the thick, impenetrable fog that had begun to settle in again. And then, something even stranger happened. The camera, the one they found at the scene, had been examined in the hope of finding some clue. But when they opened the file, there were no photographs. No images. Only the sound of static. Some said it was a glitch. Some said it was a coincidence. But those who had heard the rumors about the swamp and about the ghosts that haunted it couldn't help but wonder. Had Alex truly escaped the phantoms of the swamp? Or had they claimed him, just like they had claimed the others before him? As the days passed, the people who knew Alex moved on, the life of the small town continuing in its quiet rhythm. But for a few, there was no forgetting. They still heard his voice in the whispers of the wind, felt the presence of his shadow just beyond the trees. For others, the memory of Alex's disappearance began to blur with the others who had gone missing in the swamp over the years. The lost, the forgotten, the ones who never came back. But for one person still living in the town, there was a lingering question. One that refused to be answered. The figure by the water. Was it Alex? Or had it been something else? Something waiting, watching, always just beyond the reach of the living. And perhaps the most chilling thought of all. What if Alex had never really left the swamp at all? The echoes of the lost were still there, lingering, forever. It was a quiet evening when the town received the final, unexpected visit. A lone figure stood at the edge of the swamp, looking out into the dense fog that rolled like a living entity across the water. The wind was still, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. The figure had the same dark eyes, the same weary look that Alex had carried with him in his final days. But there was something different now. There was no hesitation in his movements, no trace of fear. Just a quiet, resolute silence. He stood there, waiting, watching the water for what seemed like an eternity. Behind him, the town carried on, unaware, as always, of what lingered just beyond their sight. People came and went, busy with their own lives, with their own thoughts. Life had returned to its usual pace, undisturbed by the whispers of the past. But the swamp had a different rhythm. Its pulse never ceased, its secrets always waiting, always shifting beneath the surface. As the figure turned to leave, something caught his eye. A shadow, no, not just a shadow. A movement. Something familiar. Then, for just a moment, the figure, Alex, felt a cold hand close around his heart. The silhouette of his brother was there, at the edge of the water, beckoning him with that same unspoken invitation. But this time, Alex didn't approach. This time, he turned his back and stepped away from the edge. The whispers of the swamp had tried to claim him once more, just as they had claimed so many others. But he was different now. He had survived. Or so he thought. For the echoes never truly fade. The swamp's grip is endless, its call unyielding. Even after death, the shadows of the past linger, waiting for the next lost soul to come too close. And sometimes, just sometimes, they do not let go. Alex knew that, as he walked away from the swamp, he had only escaped it for a time. The memories, the images of those he had loved and lost, would follow him always. In every reflection, in every shadow, he would hear their voices, their calls, forever. And the swamp, with its endless fog and its ghostly whispers, would never truly release him. Because the swamp claimed not only bodies but souls. And Alex, like so many before him, had become one of the echoes. Forever. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.